The Mafia Boss found his secretary sitting alone at Christmas dinner and shocked everyone. Malcolm Reddick walked into the Halcyon Grand's ballroom that Christmas Eve and didn't even look for his wife. He walked straight to the bar, ordered a drink, and checked his phone, and Zora Bellamy watched him from across the room, with a smile still frozen on her face from pretending everything was fine. She had been standing beside that Christmas tree for 43 minutes, dressed in a deep burgundy gown that cost more than she should have spent. Hair done, heels on, waiting. Malcolm took his drink and turned toward a group of executives near the window. He laughed at something one of them said. He never once scanned the room for her. If you have ever stood in a crowd feeling completely alone, if you have ever held a smile, so long your face started to ache, you already know exactly what that moment costs a person. Now imagine discovering, 5 minutes later, that your husband wasn't delayed by work at all. That his location shows up inside an apartment building you don't recognize. That the woman he's been spending those late nights at the office with has a name and a face and a life your husband preferred over yours. What would you do? If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like a placeholder, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Halcyon Grand Hotel had a particular quality on Christmas Eve that made loneliness feel worse than it did anywhere else. Everything was too beautiful. The chandeliers threw light across the ballroom ceiling in patterns that looked like snowflakes. The tree in the center of the room stood 12 feet tall and was decorated by someone who got paid to make things look perfect. The music was low and elegant, the kind of music designed to feel like the background of someone else's romantic evening. Zora Bellamy stood beside that tree, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched in 20 minutes, and she was thinking about numbers. That was how her brain worked under pressure. Not poetry. Not rage. Numbers. 43 minutes since the dinner started. 60 people in the room, at least half of them, watching her with the polite curiosity people reserve for a spectacle they haven't quite identified yet. 3 different colleagues had already asked where Malcolm was. She had given the same answer 3 times: work emergency. He'll be here soon, and each time the words came out of her mouth with less convincing weight. She was 34 years old. She wore a size 16. She had warm brown skin and full natural lashes, and the kind of posture that made strangers think she was taller than she was. She had also spent the better part of 3 years being the most efficient, most perceptive, most quietly formidable person in whatever room Kwon Tae-gyeom occupied. And right now, standing beside this Christmas tree in front of 60 witnesses, she felt exactly like the woman she had spent years convincing herself she wasn't. The woman who waited. She checked her phone again. Not Malcolm's texts. She'd stopped reading those 20 minutes ago when they went from apologetic to vague to something that smelled like a performance. She opened the location sharing app instead. The one Malcolm suggested they install 18 months ago after she mentioned a friend's husband had gotten into a car accident and nobody knew where he was for 6 hours. Malcolm had been so reasonable about it, so considerate. His location loaded. Zora looked at the address. She didn't know the street. She zoomed in. It was on the north side, a residential building, on a block she had driven past a handful of times but never had reason to stop. The pin was stationary. Had been stationary based on the timestamp for at least 2 hours. She stood there holding the phone and just let the information arrive. Not a bar, not an office, not a restaurant where a work emergency had turned into drinks and then dinner. A residential building on Christmas Eve. The sparkling water glass came down on the table beside her a little harder than she intended. A woman nearby glanced over. Zora straightened her shoulders and nodded at her with the most composed expression she had ever assembled in her life. Then she walked to the coat room to get some air, and she ran directly into Kwon Tae-gyeom. Was 42 years old, and he had the kind of face that made rooms go quiet when he entered them, not because he was classically handsome, though he was, but because something in his expression communicated that he had assessed every exit before he chose where to stand. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he carried himself the way men do when they've never had to announce their presence because the room already knew. Tae-gyeom noticed things. That was the quality Zora had identified within her first week of working for him, not intelligence exactly, though he was genuinely intelligent, but perception. He watched people the way other executives watched market reports. Constantly, quietly, like he was always 3 moves ahead and had already decided which moves weren't worth making. He took one look at her face and said, "Where's your coat?" Not a question, more like he was verifying something. "I was just getting air," Zora said. "There's a balcony." "Come." "Tae-gyeom, I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment in that particular way. He had the look that said he wasn't arguing, because arguing would be inefficient when he was already correct. Then he pushed the balcony door open and stood back. Zora walked through it, because arguing with that look was its own kind of exhausting. The cold hit her immediately. Chicago in December was never polite about itself. It was the kind of cold that got into your lungs and reminded you the city didn't particularly care whether you were comfortable. Snow had been falling since 6 o'clock, and it was accumulating on the wrought iron railing in soft, uneven lines. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at the street below. Tae-gyeom said nothing for almost a full minute. He just stood beside her and let the silence exist without needing to fill it, which was one of the things about him she had never learned to fully anticipate. Most people filled silences. He collected them. "Malcolm isn't coming," she said finally. "No," Tae-gyeom said. It wasn't a guess. The way he said it flat, certain made her turn and look at him. "What do you mean, no?" He kept his eyes on the street below. "I mean, I assumed he wasn't when you were standing beside that tree, looking like you were doing math problems in your head." "I was doing math problems in my head, I know." A pause. "You check your phone when you already know the answer, and you're just confirming it. You've been checking it all evening." Zora looked back at the street. A car moved slowly through the snow below them, headlights sweeping yellow across the white. "I found his location." Nothing from Tae-gyeom. "He's at an apartment building on the north side." "Has been for 2 hours." She said it the way said a number in a budget meeting, just information. Just fact, nothing loaded onto it yet. "I don't know the building," Tae-gyeom said. "I do." She turned again. He was still looking at the street, and something in the line of his jaw had gone tight. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Zora, tell me." "It's a woman named Bryn Carraway. She works in Malcolm's division. It's been 4 months. The cold got worse somehow. Or maybe it wasn't the cold at all." 4 months, Zora repeated. "Yes. And you've known weeks." She stared at him. He turned and met it, didn't flinch, didn't offer her something softer to land on. Just held her gaze the way a person does when they've already decided the most honest thing they can do is stay in the room. "Weeks," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, which she was aware of in a distant way, the same way she was aware of the snow on her shoulders and the cold in her fingers. "You knew for 6 weeks and you didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" He looked back at the street for just a moment, like he was choosing the exact right words and rejecting the wrong ones in real time. "Because you don't want to be rescued, Zora. You need information. You need to be the person who makes the decision. A beat. If I'd come to you 6 weeks ago with this, it would have felt like I was managing you, making the choice of when and how you found out." He glanced at her. "I couldn't do that to you." She opened her mouth. Closed it. "I also could not have someone watching Malcolm after that," he said. "Which you will probably be angry about." "I'm already angry about it." "I know. You had someone surveilling my husband. I had someone checking on why my most effective strategist had been distracted for 3 months. What he found was Malcolm." Tae-gyeom's voice didn't change. "I didn't go looking for this, Zora." She turned away from him and looked at the city. Chicago lay below them, brilliant and indifferent in the snow, 50,000 lit windows belonging to 50,000 lives, none of which were hers right now. Her chest felt strange, not shattered exactly. More like something that had been under pressure for a long time had just decompressed. Like a slow leak she hadn't known was there until the thing went flat. 4 months. Bryn Carraway. She thought about the last 4 months and tried to locate the moments that should have told her. The late nights, the distracted dinners, The way Malcolm had stopped asking about her work, even in the performative way he used to. The way she had talked herself out of asking questions because she was tired after her own long days, and asking questions required emotional energy she never seemed to have left over at the end of them. She had been calling it marriage fatigue. Zora Tae-gyeom's voice was different now. Quieter. Not softer exactly, he didn't really do soft, but closer to it. He reached over and with 2 fingers, very gently, wiped something from the side of her face. She hadn't even registered that it was wet. Malcolm Reddick, Taeum said quietly, is a man who was handed the most capable woman in this city and spent 4 years making her feel like she should be grateful for the transaction. He let his hand drop. That's his failure, not yours. She turned to look at him. His expression was exactly what it always was, contained. Careful, a wall with a very precise window in it, but the window was open. She didn't examine what that meant. Not then. She was still holding on to anger as a structural object, angry at Malcolm, angry at Tae-gyeom for knowing, angry at herself for being 34 years old and standing on a balcony in the cold discovering her marriage in a location-sharing app. I have to go, she said. I know, I'm going to go confront him. I know that too. Don't send anyone after me. A pause. Zora, I mean it, don't. Another pause. Then, all right. She went back inside, collected her coat from the coat room, and walked out of the Halcyon Grand Hotel into the Chicago snow. Malcolm was already home by the time she got there. That surprised her somehow. She had half expected him to be unreachable, to come home at midnight with an excuse already prepared and polished. But he was sitting in the living room with his jacket off and his tie loosened and a glass of whiskey in his hand, and when she walked in he started talking before she had even closed the door. Zora, I know I'm late. The situation at work completely got away from me, and by the time Bryn Caraway, she said. The sentence died in his throat. She stood in the entryway, still wearing her coat, snow still in her hair. She had stopped crying somewhere between the hotel and the street. Now she felt like a person who had put everything unnecessary down in order to carry one very specific thing. Zora, don't. She set her bag down on the console table by the door. Very precisely, like she was setting down something fragile. Don't do whatever comes next. Just tell me how long. Malcolm put the whiskey glass down. He looked at her, and for a moment she could see him calculating. She knew that look. She had seen it across 1,000 meetings, the look of a man deciding how much truth costs and whether he can afford a different number. She watched him decide the calculation was already broken. 4 months, he said. She nodded. It wasn't Zora. It wasn't something I planned. You and I have been so distant, and I was lonely, and she stopped talking about her. He stopped. She walked past him to the kitchen because she needed to be moving. She stood at the counter and braced both hands on it and looked at the backsplash they had picked out together at a tile store in Lincoln Park. She remembered that day. They'd argued about the color. She'd won. I have been working a demanding job, she said, for 3 years. I have come home tired. I have missed dinners. I have had months where I was so consumed by what Tae-gyeom's company needed that I was present in this apartment and not in this marriage. She turned around. And I have felt guilty about that. For 3 years I have told myself that I owed you more attention and more presence and more of myself than I was giving, and I have tried to be a better wife to you. A breath. While you spent those 3 years deciding that effort wasn't worth responding to. Malcolm was on his feet now. It's not that simple. Don't tell me what it is. Her voice was still quiet. She needed it to stay quiet, or she was going to lose the only thing that felt like hers right now. I'm going to sleep at my sister's tonight. I want you to spend that time deciding what you're planning to do with the rest of this conversation, because when I come back, I'm going to need a lawyer, and I am going to need this to be over cleanly. You're not serious. She picked her bag back up off the entryway console. Zora. His voice broke slightly. She felt the sound of it move through her, not because it changed anything, but because she had loved this man once, and that love had been real, even if it had been poorly placed. And grief is grief, even when the thing you're grieving was already half gone. I'm sorry. I'm telling you, I'm sorry. You can't just... You spent 4 months choosing someone else, she said. I'm spending tonight choosing myself. She left. She didn't go to her sister's. She wasn't sure where she was going. She walked for a while, with her coat pulled tight, the snow still coming down. Chicago moving around her in that indifferent evening before, Christmas way it had, when half the city was warm inside and the other half was outside trying to get there. She passed a storefront with Christmas lights, still blinking in the window. Couple arguing quietly at a bus stop. A man asleep on a bench under cardboard that wasn't quite keeping the snow off. She ended up at the river. The Chicago River in winter looks like something that has given up fighting and gone still. Ice had formed at the edges, not solid, but thick enough to hold the snow that fell on it. The walkway beside it was empty. Zora found a bench that faced the water and sat down on it in her burgundy gown and her good coat and her heels, which were now ruined, and she just sat there. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was the strange part. She had expected the thoughts to pile in: the reconstruction, the inventory of signs she should have caught, the timeline of Bryn Carraway against the timeline of her own marriage. But mostly she just sat there feeling the cold and watching the river not move. She heard him before she saw him, the specific sound of good leather shoes on cold pavement, the deliberate non-urgency of a walk that was clearly purposeful but refused to announce itself. Tae-gyeom sat down beside her, not close, appropriate distance. He was still in his suit jacket with no coat, which struck her as absurd, and also, completely in character, he simply didn't appear to register cold as an inconvenience worth acknowledging. "I told you not to send anyone," she said. "I didn't send anyone." He looked at the river. "I came myself. That's the same thing." "It isn't." A pause. "I drove around for an hour, looking for you." She looked at him. He was watching the river with that same contained expression, but his jaw was tighter than usual, and his hands, she noticed, were laced together with more force than necessary. "Tae-gyeom, don't thank me. I'm not here to be thanked." "I wasn't going to thank you." "Good," he exhaled. "How did it go?" "It's over," she said. "I'm going to need a divorce attorney on the 26th. "You'll have one." "I can find my own attorney." "I know you can." "I'm saying you'll have one regardless." She looked back at the river. He said he was lonely, that we'd grown distant. A pause. "He's not wrong that we grew distant. I was working constantly and I wasn't present." She frowned. But somehow he decided the correct response to a difficult marriage was to handle it behind my back instead of to me. Tae-gyeom said nothing. She had learned over 3 years that his silences were participatory. He wasn't absent in them. He was listening harder. "I'm 34 years old," she said. I genuinely thought I was building a life." "You were," he said, "just not the one you thought." Snow fell between them, soft and slow. The river sat below. Somewhere on the opposite bank, a string of white lights was still on, probably forgotten by whoever put them up. "There's something I should have told you," Tae-gyeom said. She turned. He was still looking at the river, one of the few times she had ever seen him appear to be choosing words like they cost him something. "I should have told you 3 years ago," he said. "Or a year ago, or 6 weeks ago when Seo Kwon brought me Malcolm's file." He paused. "I didn't tell you any of those times because every one of them felt like the wrong time and the wrong reason." Another pause. "There's never going to be a right time, so." The snow kept falling. "I want you, Zora." His voice was even, controlled, like a person delivering a fact rather than a confession. But the fact was large enough that the control was its own kind of revelation. "Not because tonight happened. Not because you're hurting, and I'm here. Because for 3 years, you have been the person I think about when I need to understand something clearly. Because you walk into rooms full of men who want to manage you, and you let them do it right up. Until the moment you take the room apart." He finally turned and looked at her directly. "Because I have watched 100 people try to diminish you for your size, your gender, your race, watched them try to fit you into smaller shapes, and you have never once let them. A beat. And I have spent 3 years not saying that because you were married, and I don't operate that way." She held his gaze. "I'm not operating that way now," he said carefully. "You're sitting on a bench in the snow hours after your marriage ended. I am not going to make this about what I want." He looked back at the river. "I just needed you to know. So you have the information. And you can do whatever you want with it." Zora sat with that for a moment. A year ago, maybe 6 months ago, she would have known what to say. She would have had the measured, professional response ready. She would have redirected the conversation with the precise efficiency she used on every difficult thing at work. But she was sitting on a frozen bench in a ruined dress on Christmas Eve, and her marriage was over, and the most controlled, most perceptive, most relentlessly intimidating man she had ever met had just told her, in his own stripped-down way, that she was the one person he couldn't strategize around. "What does that actually look like?" she said finally. "You and me." He thought about it seriously. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, didn't give her a polished version. "Complicated," he said. "Protective in ways that will probably make you angry sometimes. Loyal in ways I can guarantee." A pause. "Dangerous occasionally. The parts of my world I've kept away from you would get closer. I know what your world is, Tae-gyeom. Knowing from a professional distance is different from being in it. I know that too." The river sat between them and the city. A barge was frozen somewhere upstream, and its lights were still on, red and green, weirdly festive. "Go home," he said. "Not to Malcolm. I'll arrange an apartment tonight, clean, secure, nothing you didn't ask for. And we don't talk about this again until you've had time to not be in the middle of a crisis." That could take months, I know. He stood, brushed snow from his jacket shoulders in one crisp motion. "I've been waiting 3 years, Zora. A few more months isn't going to be the thing that breaks me." He offered her his hand, not romantically, just a hand. Something to stand up with. She took it and stood, and the snow was deep enough now that the city had gone mostly quiet around them. He walked her to a car she hadn't noticed, waiting at the curb. She didn't ask how long it had been there. She was too tired, and the answer was something that would make her argue with him, and she didn't have the energy for that tonight. She got in. He closed the door behind her. Through the window, in the blue-white light of a Chicago December at midnight, Kwon Tae-gyeom stood on the riverbank with snow on his shoulders and watched the car pull away. His expression was what it always was in public, contained, unreadable, giving nothing away to anyone watching. But Zora had spent 3 years learning to read the things he didn't give away. He stood there until the car turned the corner. He didn't move until he couldn't see it anymore. The apartment Tae-gyeom arranged was on the 23rd floor of a building in River North, and it was exactly what he promised: clean, secure, and nothing she hadn't asked for. No flowers on the table, no welcome note with his name on it, no gestures that would have felt like pressure, dressed up as consideration. Just a key card left with the front desk, a fully stocked refrigerator, because someone had anticipated that she wouldn't want to go anywhere on Christmas morning, and a view of the city that made Chicago look like something it occasionally forgot to be still and quietly beautiful and not actively trying to take something from you. Zora stood at the window for a long time the morning after. She had slept in her clothes because she hadn't thought to pack anything, and there was nothing in the closet because Tae-gyeom wasn't the kind of man who kept a spare wardrobe in a furnished apartment like some kind of standing expectation. She'd find that detail both reassuring and depressing for reasons she didn't fully examine yet. Her phone had 41 notifications. 17 of them were Malcolm. She read none of them. She called her sister Renata instead. Renata answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd already somehow heard something. Renata had a network of information that functioned independently of any knowledge, and Zora had stopped trying to understand it years ago. "Tell me," Renata said. So Zora told her. Standing at the window, looking at the city, she laid out the whole thing in the flat, even voice she used when she was holding something together by willpower alone. Malcolm, Bryn Carraway, 4 months, the location app. The conversation in the kitchen, the river. She left out the part about Tae-gyeom at the river. She wasn't ready to make that part a conversation yet. Renata was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Then you need clothes." "I need a lot of things. Start with clothes. I'll be there in an hour." Renata arrived in 50 minutes with a rolling suitcase and a paper bag containing coffee and a breakfast sandwich, and she came through the apartment door, set everything down, hugged Zora for exactly as long as Zora needed to be hugged, and then pulled back and looked at her sister's face with the particular precision of a woman who had known Zora since she was 7 years old. You're not destroyed, Renata said. No. You look like someone who's been holding something heavy for a long time and just put it down. Zora thought about that. That's actually accurate. How long did you know something was wrong? I didn't know. I suspected. I talked myself out of it. Because you were busy or because you didn't want to look? It was the kind of question only a sister could ask, and only a certain kind of sister would. Zora picked up the coffee and drank half of it before she answered. Both, she said, probably both. Renata nodded, like that answer was complete enough, and moved on. She was good at that, pressing exactly once, and then letting the thing breathe. Quality Zora had always loved about her. They spent the morning not talking about Malcolm. They talked about everything else. Renata's kids, a neighbor dispute that had been ongoing for 8 months and showed no signs of resolution. A restaurant that had opened 3 blocks from Renata's house that they should go to sometime in January. Normal things, living world things. Things that reminded Zora that outside the specific wreckage of her marriage, the world was still operating according to its usual indifferent schedule, and that was neither comforting nor devastating. It was just true. Malcolm called twice while Renata was there. Zora sent both calls to voicemail. On the 3rd call, she picked up. I need to talk to you, he said. You're talking to me. Not like this, in person. I need you to come home so we can… I'm not coming home, Malcolm. A pause. She could hear him breathing. Could hear the specific quality of his breath, shallow, controlled in the way that meant he was managing something. She had listened to Malcolm breathe across a pillow for 4 years, and she knew his emotional register by sound the way you know a song you've heard too many times. Zora, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I am fully aware of that. But you walking out and going to stay at his apartment is not… Whose apartment? Don't do that. You know whose. I'm staying in an apartment. You don't get to audit the address. He owns the building, Zora. His name is on the deed. I had someone check. She went still. Not because it surprised her, it didn't. Particularly Tae-gyeom owned approximately 1/3 of the significant real estate in the relevant quadrant of Chicago, but because of the sentence before it. I had someone check. You had someone check, she said. I'm trying to understand where my wife is. Your wife? The words came out quiet and with a specific edge she hadn't planned. Malcolm. You have been sleeping with someone else for 4 months. The vocabulary of possession you are using right now is not available to you. Quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his voice, subtle like a key change. I'm just saying that the optics of this are Zora. People are going to talk. You leaving on Christmas Eve and going directly to stay with your boss, who everyone already whispers about. Goodbye, Malcolm. Zora. She ended the call. Renata had moved to the kitchen counter and was very carefully not looking at her with an expression that communicated she had heard everything. Optics, Renata said, yes. He cheated for 4 months and he's worried about optics. Apparently. Renata picked up her own coffee cup and drank from it with the energy of a woman physically restraining herself from commentary. Zora appreciated the restraint enormously. I need to call my attorney, Zora said. It's Christmas. I know. I'll call her on the 26th. The 26th arrived with 3 more calls from Malcolm, a text from someone named Diffris who identified himself as Malcolm's friend and asked Zora to consider what she was doing to Malcolm's mental state, and an email from a woman named Bryn Carraway that Zora read once, then deleted without responding. The email was an apology. Zora supposed she should feel something complex about that. Mostly she just felt tired. She was back at work on the 27th. The decision surprised even her a little. She had considered taking the week. Tae-gyeom had told her she could take whatever time she needed, and he had meant it. She knew he meant it because he'd said it without any inflection that suggested he wanted her back in the office. Apartment was quiet in a way that had started feeling like a room she was filling with the wrong thoughts, and work was the one place where he had always known exactly what she was doing and why. She walked into the headquarters building at 8:15, badged through security, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and sat down at her desk. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it on the 23rd. The only difference was a single cup of coffee from her preferred place, 3 blocks away, still hot, sitting on the corner of her desk with no note. She sat there for a moment looking at it. Then she picked it up and drank it and opened her email. Tae-gyeom came through the glass office doors at 9 o'clock. He looked at her desk, registered her presence with the usual economy of expression, and said, "You didn't have to come in." "I know." "All right." He went to his office. That was it. No performance of concern, no careful checking in. He let her be present without making her presence a thing that required management. She filed that away, in the place she kept observations about him that she wasn't ready to analyze yet, which had become a substantial file over the past 4 days. Jin Kwon was a different matter. Kwon was Tae-gyeom's security chief, 45 years old. Built like someone who had spent 20 years deciding that physical intimidation was a language worth becoming fluent in, and possessed of a loyalty to Tae-gyeom that was total and genuine, and left approximately no room for anyone who might complicate the object of that loyalty. He had worked for Tae-gyeom since they were both younger men in a city that was considerably less forgiving than the one they currently operated in, and he had feelings about Zora that had never been hostile exactly, but had never been warm either. He stopped by her desk at 10:30. "You're back," he said. "I am." He looked at her for a moment. Not unfriendly. Not friendly. Malcolm Reddick called the main line twice yesterday. She set her pen down. "What did he say?" Asked to speak to Tae-gyeom. "I told him that wasn't going to happen." He left a number. Kwon placed a post-it on her desk with a phone number on it. Also said that he had information about the company's operations that certain parties might find interesting. Zora looked at the post-it. "He's bluffing," she said. "Probably. But stupid bluffs from angry ex-husbands have a way of becoming expensive problems." Kwon's voice was level. "Professional. Tae-gyeom is aware. I'm telling you because it's your situation, and you have a right to know it's extending into this building." "Thank you, Kwon." He looked at her for one more moment. Something moved through his expression that she didn't quite have a name for, not sympathy, but adjacent to it in some complicated way. Then he walked back down the hall. Zora sat with the post-it for a moment. Then she picked up her desk phone and dialed Malcolm's number. He answered immediately, which told her he'd been waiting. "Don't call this office again," she said. "Zora, I'm not having a conversation with you. I'm telling you a fact. You call Tae-gyeom's company again. You threaten or imply or gesture toward any kind of disclosure about his business, and you will have legally exposed yourself to a retaliation that I genuinely do not want to watch happen to you." She kept her voice absolutely even. "I am trying to give you a way out of this that doesn't end badly for you. Please take it." Silence on the line for a moment. Then, "Is that a threat, Zora? Are you threatening me on behalf of your boyfriend?" "He's not my boyfriend. He's not your boss anymore either, based on the apartment you're living in." She felt something tighten in her chest and she breathed through it. "Goodbye, Malcolm. I filed a police report," he said. She stopped. "This morning. I filed a report stating that my wife was emotionally manipulated and potentially held against her will by her employer, whose criminal associations are well documented, and that I have reason to believe she is in a coercive situation." The words arrived one at a time, each one landing with a specific weight. Filed as she stopped. Started again. "You are aware that I am sitting at my desk, that I came to work voluntarily, that I have been a functional adult human being making my own decisions for the entirety of my adult life." "I'm aware of what it looks like from the outside," Malcolm said. "Wife discovers husband's affair. Wife leaves. Wife shows up in an apartment owned by her wealthy boss. Wire reports suggest the boss has organized crime ties. I'm just a concerned husband trying to protect his wife." He had rehearsed it. She could hear the architecture of it, the careful phrasing, the specific word choices, the way he had assembled the pieces to create a shape that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with optics. Her own word from the other day, turned around and used against her. "You will regret this," she said, "maybe a beat. But right now, Zora, I'm the wronged husband and you're the plus-size secretary who moved into her criminal boss's apartment 4 hours after walking out on her marriage. Let's see which story the internet finds more interesting." The call ended. She sat holding the phone receiver for 3 seconds. Then she put it down, stood up, walked to Tae-gyeom's office door, and knocked. Come. She opened the door. He was behind his desk, with 2 documents open in front of him. He looked up, read her face in approximately 1 second, and set the documents down. Malcolm filed a police report, she said, claiming I'm being held against my will. Tae-gyeom's expression didn't change. When this morning? Pause. He leaned back in his chair. She watched him process it, not panicking, not even appearing particularly surprised. Just running the calculation with the efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years being the subject of police interest and had developed a methodology around it. Kwon, he said, already told me about the calls. He doesn't know about the report. He will in about 6 minutes. Tae-gyeom stood. I need you to not be angry with me for the next 30 seconds. That depends entirely on what you're about to say. I need you to speak with detectives when they arrive. Not because I'm asking you to cover for me, there's nothing to cover. But because your account is the only one that matters here, and I need you to give it voluntarily, completely, and before anyone can suggest you were coached. She looked at him. You're asking me to handle this myself. Yes, not to defer to your lawyers or let Kwon manage it. Your words, your presence, your choice. That's the only thing that defeats this specific move. He held her gaze. Can you do that? It wasn't really a question. They both knew it wasn't really a question. She had walked into boardrooms full of men twice her age who wanted her to disappear, and she had made herself the most important person in the room without raising her voice. Yes, she said. The detectives arrived at 2:15. There were 2 of them. A woman named Hargrove, who had the permanent mild exhaustion of someone who'd seen enough domestic situations to know most of them were exactly what they appeared to be, and a younger man named Peltz, who tried to seem neutral and mostly managed it. They had been sent to conduct a welfare check, which was the official framing, and they had the professional awkwardness of people who suspected they'd been sent on an errand by someone with an agenda. Kwon intercepted them in the lobby. Zora intercepted Kwon. I'll take them, she said. He looked at her. Zora. Kwon. She said his name without heat and without apology. I'll take them. A beat. He stepped aside. She brought the detectives to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Not Tae-gyeom's floor. Not somewhere that felt like his territory. Splitting. A neutral room with a glass table and chairs and a window that looked out over the street and communicated nothing except that this was a business building where professional things occurred. She poured water for all 3 of them. She sat down across from Hargrove and Peltz without being asked, and she put her hands flat on the table. I know why you're here, she said. My husband filed a report this morning claiming I'm in a coercive situation. I'm here to tell you directly that I am not. She looked at Hargrove, then Peltz. A sound like Green Woodforth, I discovered, Greetan, that my husband has been having an affair for 4 months. I confronted him at our home. I told him I wanted a divorce. I left voluntarily and I am currently staying in a residence I have access to entirely by my own choosing. She paused. I came to work this morning because I chose to. I spoke to you today because I chose to. If you have questions, please ask them. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. You don't seem distressed. I was distressed 4 days ago. Currently, I'm managing. Your husband indicates that your employer has had significant influence over your life and your decisions over the past 3 years. My employer has had significant influence over the decisions of approximately 400 employees at this company, Zora said. That's what employers do. I am also his primary strategist and have had significant influence over his decisions. That's also how employment relationships work, when both parties are competent. Pause. Peltz made a small note. Hargrove's expression shifted into something more genuine, still professional, but with a specific quality of recognition in it, like a woman who had seen a version of this setup before and was arriving at the same conclusion she usually did. You are here willingly, Hargrove said. Yes? And you feel free to leave at any time. I am leaving right now, Zora said, to go back to my desk and finish the contracts I was working on before you arrived. Unless you need something else. Hargrove closed her notebook. We don't, she said. Thank you for your time. Peltz looked like he wanted to say something. He decided against it. They left. Zora sat in the conference room for exactly 1 minute after the elevator doors closed on the detectives. Then she walked back upstairs. Tae-gyeom was in the hallway outside his office. Clearly positioned himself there to be accessible without appearing to have been waiting, which was a particular skill of his that she had always found both impressive and transparent. He looked at her as she came down the hall. "Done," she said. "And they're gone. It's over." She kept walking. "Malcolm burned his credibility on a welfare check that I dismantled in 20 minutes. He's going to know that by tonight." She went back to her desk. She sat down. She stared at the contract open on her screen and did not read a single word of it for approximately 90 seconds. Then Tae-gyeom appeared at the edge of her workspace. Not at her desk, just at the boundary of it, respecting the geometry of the space the way he always did, never entering without an implicit invitation. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was just accurate. Those are the same thing sometimes." She looked up at him. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression was, it was the window again. The one that was open. The same one she'd seen on the balcony and at the river, and was now seeing in the flat fluorescent daylight of a work corridor and finding equally difficult to categorize. "Tae-gyeom," she said. "Yes, I've made a decision." He waited. I'm not making decisions about anything significant right now. My marriage is 4 days dead, and I'm not in a position to make decisions that matter under those conditions. She met his gaze. "But I want you to know that I heard you. At the river. And I'm not dismissing it." Something moved in his face. Small, controlled, present. "Understood," he said. "Good." She turned back to her screen. "Now let me finish this contract." He walked back to his office. She read approximately 40 words of the contract before she realized her hands were not entirely steady on the keyboard, which annoyed her precisely because she had been so composed for the past 3 hours that her hands choosing now to register the accumulated stress of the day felt like poor timing. She pressed them flat on the desk and breathed for a moment. Outside the window, Chicago moved in its gray January way, indifferent and loud and entirely unconcerned with the specific seismic activity happening on the 14th floor. Malcolm's retaliation didn't wait long. By the second week of January, 2 gossip-adjacent news sites had published variations of the same story. The framing was careful enough to avoid direct defamation, careful enough that a lawyer's hand was visible in it, but the shape of the narrative was unmistakable. Unnamed sources close to a Chicago executive described his wife's alleged relationship with her wealthy boss. The language was particular in its cruelty, words like overweight and insecure placed adjacently to phrases about vulnerability and workplace power dynamics. One piece included a photograph of Zora arriving at the Tae-gyeom's headquarters building that had been taken without her knowledge. Renata called her the moment the first piece went up. "Zora, I've seen it. Tell me what you need." "Nothing. I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine." "I know." She was standing in the apartment kitchen with her coffee and looking at the article on her phone with the specific calm of someone deciding how to dissect a problem rather than feel it. He thought this would embarrass me into retreating. He thinks I'm ashamed of where I am. Renata was quiet for a moment. "Are you?" "No." The answer came out without hesitation, which surprised her a little and then didn't. "I am a plus-size black woman who has spent her career making herself indispensable in rooms where half the people in them decided within 30 seconds of looking at me that I didn't belong. Malcolm using my size as a weapon in a tabloid piece is not actually a new experience. He's just the first person I was supposed to trust who did it. So what are you going to do?" Zora set her coffee down. "I'm going to confirm the relationship." Silence on the line. "Renata, I didn't say anything. You were about to." "I was about to ask if you're sure." "I'm sure." She looked out the window at the city. Malcolm made a calculation. He decided that putting me next to Tae-gyeom in a tabloid story would make me look small. He's wrong. It makes me visible. And visibility is something I know how to work with. She called Tae-gyeom's PR contact at 9 o'clock that morning. By afternoon, a single statement was placed with the same outlets that had run the original stories. It was 3 sentences. It confirmed that Zora Bellamy and Kwon Tae-gyeom were in a relationship that began after Ms. Bellamy's separation from her husband. It did not apologize for this. It did not explain it further. The response online was what she had anticipated: immediate, loud, divided, and completely outside her control. She didn't read the comments. She had learned years ago that comment sections were a geography she could acknowledge existed without needing to visit. What she hadn't anticipated was Tae-gyeom's reaction. He called her that evening. Not a text. An actual call, which he used rarely and only when the content required it. "You didn't ask me," he said when she answered. "I know. I should have. I'm sorry." A pause. "I'm not angry. I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry." Another pause, longer. I needed to know if this is what you want. Publicly. Because once it's out there, the protections I've built around your professional life start changing. I know. There are people who watch my movements very carefully. Who would find you interesting now in ways you haven't had to think about before. I know that too. She let a breath out. Tae-gyeom. I spent 3 years watching you make calculated decisions about risk. I understand what I stepped into. I stepped into it on purpose. Silence on the line. Different from his conference room silences. More personal. "All right," he said finally. "All right. I want to have lunch with you tomorrow. Not a working lunch. Just lunch." "Yes," she said. "I'll pick you up at noon." He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, she smiled at something without performing it for an audience. The lunch was at a restaurant in the West Loop that was private, without being ostentatious, the kind of place Tae-gyeom chose when he didn't want to make a statement, but also didn't intend to be interrupted. A sound like green wood splitting. They sat across from each other and ordered food, and for a while they talked about work the way they always had, which was comfortable in the way that long-established are comfortable, and underneath the comfort was something that had shifted about 6 degrees from its original position and was not going back. He told her, over the main course, exactly what being with him would look like. He didn't dress it up. He laid it out the way he laid out any negotiation. Here are the assets. Here are the liabilities. Here are the terms. You tell me what you can accept. I can give you loyalty, he said. Absolute. I have never been unfaithful to anyone I've chosen, and I won't be. A pause. I can give you wealth, and I can give you protection, both of which I know you don't need from me, but which are part of what I am. Another pause. I cannot give you ordinary. My enemies are real, and my history is not clean, and there will be moments where you will be afraid, and moments where I will do things that you do not sanction. I know. Knowing it as a fact is different from living it. You keep saying that, because it's true. She looked at him across the table. In the daylight of a restaurant, not a balcony in the snow, not a frozen riverbank, not the charged atmosphere of a crisis, he looked like a man who was actually a little afraid of something, which was not an expression she had seen on him before, and which she found both entirely unexpected and strangely moving. I'm not asking for ordinary, she said. I've had ordinary. Ordinary was my husband. Deciding 4 months of lies was less complicated than having a difficult conversation. She held his gaze. I want real. I'll take complicated and honest over simple and false. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not a gesture of possession, just presence, weight and warmth, and something that was solid in the way that very little had felt solid in the past 3 weeks. She turned her hand over under his, and that was the moment, quiet, unremarkable to any other table in the restaurant, happening in the middle of a lunch in the West Loop. On a gray January afternoon, that was the moment the line got crossed. Not when he told her at the river, not when she made the statement to the press, not when she walked out of the welfare check with her head up and her voice even. This moment, his hand, her hand, the choice to turn it over. After, when they were back in his car, something that had been compressed between them for 3 years finally broke through the surface. She kissed him first. She was aware of that it was her, that she moved first, that she made the decision and executed it before she could construct a reason not to. His response was immediate, and then he pulled back. Not far, just enough. His forehead was almost against hers, and his hands were on her face, and his breathing had changed, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was probably because no one had ever seen it on him before. I need to know this is your decision, he said. His voice was rough. Not gratitude, not proximity, not 3 weeks of being in crisis and me being the constant. She looked at him. Do you think I don't know the difference? I think you're the smartest person I've ever met, and I also think you're 2 weeks out of a marriage, and I don't want to be the thing you reach for, because it's what's available. Tae-gyeom. She said his name and let it be enough of a sentence for a moment. I have been paying attention to you for 3 years. Professionally, intellectually, in ways I didn't let myself examine because I was married. She held his gaze. This is not grief. This is not proximity. I have wanted to have this conversation with you for a long time, and the only thing that's changed is that I am now allowed to have it. He was very still. So she said, unless you've changed your mind. He kissed her, and this time neither of them stopped. The security detail started within the week. Zora noticed the first car 2 days into the new arrangement, a dark sedan that appeared in the parking structure of her building every morning and disappeared every evening. She noticed the second one, 3 days after that, positioned across from the coffee shop she stopped at every morning at 7:45. She noticed the way Kwon had started coordinating her schedule in ways that didn't require his involvement, and probably hadn't before. She said nothing for 10 days. Then one evening in Tae-gyeom's apartment, hers now had a few things in it. His now had a few things in it. They were in that stage of a new relationship that involves the gradual but inevitable migration of personal objects. She sat on the kitchen counter while he was making coffee, and she said, "The sedan." He didn't look up from the coffee. "Yes, the one that's been following me for 10 days. It's not following you. It's positioned to Taeum." He looked up. "I am not a package," she said. "I am not a document you need secure transport for. I am not an asset that requires a perimeter." She kept her voice even. "I appreciate that your instinct is to protect things you care about. I understand where that comes from, and I am not dismissing it. But I will not trade one man who needed to control my environment for another one who does it more expensively." He held her gaze, his jaw was tight. "There are people who know about us now. People who would look at you as leverage. I know. You don't know all of them. I know enough." She didn't move from the counter. "I need you to hear what I'm telling you. If I am going to be in your life the way we are talking about, then I have to be in it as myself. Not as a protected object, not as something you manage. As the person who sits across from you and tells you when you're wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Which I am doing right now. You are wrong about this." He turned back to the coffee. She waited. He was quiet for a long time. She could see the tension in his shoulders, and she let it be there, because he needed to arrive at this by himself. She couldn't walk him there. "2," he said finally. She blinked. "What?" "2 security contacts. Not a tail, not surveillance. 2 people I can reach in under 3 minutes if something happens." He turned back. "Not following you. Positioned. You won't see them unless something requires it. Consider this. I'll know who they are. Yes. And I can tell them to stand down if I'm somewhere I've assessed as safe." His jaw worked. "Within reason. Within my reason. Not yours." Another silence. Then yes. She got off the counter. Poured her own coffee. "Thank you. You're going to be difficult about every single one of these," he said. It wasn't quite a complaint. It was more like a man realizing he had signed up for something that was going to require him to grow in directions he hadn't anticipated. "Yes," she said pleasantly. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one reluctant and real and slightly against his will. This was not going to be simple. She was not going to make herself smaller to fit inside the shape of his protectiveness, and he was going to have to genuinely learn, not just agree to the difference between love that shelters and love that confines. She knew that. He was beginning to know it. What she didn't know, yet what neither of them could see coming through the window of their particular January, was that Malcolm Reddick was not finished. And the thing about a man who has decided that losing gracefully is beneath him is that he will keep reaching for weapons until he finds one that actually lands. Malcolm Reddick had always been a man who understood presentation. He knew how to enter a room. He knew which suit communicated authority versus approachability. He knew how to deliver bad news in meetings so that the bad news somehow reflected well on him. He'd spent 15 years in corporate finance, constructing a version of himself that was polished and reasonable and easy to be around. And that version had served him extremely well right up until the moment it stopped working entirely. By mid-February, it had stopped working entirely. The welfare check had produced nothing. The tabloid stories had backfired instead of making Zora look small. They had put her photograph next to Guillaume's name in every outlet that ran the story, which turned out to function more like a promotion than a punishment. 3 of Zora's professional contacts had reached out afterward, not with condolence or concern, but with interest. One was a board member of a company Tae-gyeom had been trying to get a meeting with for 8 months. He'd called Zora directly. Malcolm had done, in 2 press placements, what Zora's 3 years of quiet competence had not yet fully accomplished. He had made her publicly visible in a city where visibility was its own form of currency. He understood that. He was not a stupid man. What he was by February was a desperate one. Zora knew this the way she knew most things, not from the accumulation of small, but from the small signals that added up to a picture if you were paying the right kind of attention. Malcolm had stopped calling. The texts had gone quiet. The friend named Darius had gone quiet. Even the lawyer's letters, which had arrived with some regularity through January in the early stages of the divorce proceedings, had slowed to a trickle. Silence from Malcolm Reddick was not peace. It was preparation. She said this to Tae-gyeom on a Thursday evening in late February when they were in his apartment going over acquisition documents that she had restructured twice because the original version had a liability buried in clause 14 that his legal team had missed and she had not. "He's building something," she said. Tae-gyeom didn't look up from the document she had placed in front of him. "Seokwon is watching. I know. I'm not asking you to do something. I'm telling you what I think." He looked up then. He had learned, over the past 2 months, to give her his full attention when she said, "I'm telling you what I think," because the times he hadn't had cost him something. Kind of something? I don't know yet. But Malcolm went quiet, and Malcolm doesn't go quiet unless he's found an angle. She turned a page in her own copy of the documents. "He said he had information about your operations. I told him at the time that he was bluffing. I'm less certain of that now." Tae-gyeom was very still for a moment. What changed? He worked in corporate finance for 15 years. He's not an investigator, but he knows how money moves and he knows how to read a corporate structure. She paused. And he has been angry enough, for long enough, to do something genuinely stupid. A silence. "I'll talk to Seokwon tonight," Tae-gyeom said. Good. She went back to clause 14. Seokwon's report arrived the following Monday. Malcolm had, in fact, been building something. He had spent 6 weeks quietly collecting fragments public records, property filings, shipping manifests that were technically accessible to anyone, with the time and the right filing numbers. Corporate registration documents from 3 of Tae-gyeom's subsidiary companies. Individually, each piece was innocuous, publicly available. The kind of thing any competent financial journalist could find with enough motivation. Together, assembled in the right sequence, they suggested a pattern that someone familiar with Tae-gyeom's actual operations would recognize immediately as pointing toward the right doors, even if it couldn't open any of them. Malcolm had given this assembled package to 2 people. One was a journalist at a mid-tier business publication who covered financial crime-adjacent stories. The other was a federal investigator named Harlan Voss, who worked out of the Chicago field office and had, according to Seokwon's intelligence, been building a peripheral file on Tae-gyeom's shipping operations for approximately 18 months, without ever quite getting enough to move on it. Swan delivered this information standing in Tae-gyeom's office at 7 in the morning, with his arms at his sides, and his expression communicating the specific quality of alertness that meant the situation had already moved past the point of comfortable management. Tae-gyeom listened without interrupting. Zora was not supposed to be there. Was there because she had arrived at 6:45. She had been doing that more often, arriving earlier than anyone expected, which Seokwon had stopped commenting on after she had given him a look that discouraged future commentary, and she had been in the adjoining office reviewing logistics contracts when Seokwon arrived, and she had simply walked through the connecting door when when she heard the tone of his voice. Kwon had looked at Tae-gyeom when she appeared. Tae-gyeom had looked at Zora. She had sat down in the chair beside the window and said, "Continue." Kwon had continued. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Tae-gyeom said, "How much does Voss have?" From Malcolm, fragments. "Nothing that opens a prosecution on its own." Kwon's voice was even. "But Voss is not working from Malcolm's package alone. He has 18 months of independent surveillance, and some of what Malcolm gave him will have confirmed threads." Voss was already pulling. A pause. If they work the journalist angle, simultaneously get a public piece running, while Voss escalates internally, it creates pressure to move faster than the evidence strictly requires. Tae-gyeom said nothing. Zora was looking at her hands in her lap. She was doing the calculation. She could feel herself doing it, the same way she always did, laying variables in sequence and running outcomes. Malcolm had handed fragments to a journalist and a federal investigator. The fragments were suggestive, but not prosecutorial. The threat was not immediate arrest. The threat was exposure and acceleration, forcing Tae-gyeom's hand, creating noise that attracted more noise, making the comfortable distances he had maintained between his legitimate companies and his other operations suddenly inadequate. And Malcolm had done all of this knowing exactly what he was pointing at. Not because he had genuine evidence of serious crimes. Because he wanted to burn the building down, and he didn't care who was inside it. "He's going to get someone hurt," she said. Both men looked at her. "He doesn't actually have enough to prosecute anyone," she said. "You know that, and Voss probably knows that, and the journalist is going to figure it out before he can publish anything that survives a legal review." She kept her voice even. "But the noise is going to make your partners nervous. It's going to make the subsidiary directors nervous. Nervous people make different decisions than calm ones." She looked at Tae-gyeom. "Malcolm is not trying to prosecute you. He's trying to destabilize you. Make you reactive. Make you do something you wouldn't do if you had time to think." The silence in the room was the particular kind that meant she was right, and everyone knew she was right, and nobody liked it. Kwon said, "We should handle Reddick." Tae-gyeom looked at him. "Directly," Kwon said. His voice was entirely without inflection. "Remove the source of the problem." Zora's head came up. "No," she said. Kwon didn't look at her. He was looking at Tae-gyeom with the focused patience of a man who had been having a version of this conversation for 20 years and had always eventually been given the answer he was waiting for. "No," Zora said again more clearly. "Zora." Tae-gyeom's voice was quiet. "Don't Zora me. I know what handle directly means, and the answer is no." She stood up from the chair. She was aware of the size of the room and the size of the two men in it. She stood up anyway because sitting felt like something she couldn't do with this particular conversation happening over her. "Malcolm is stupid and angry, and he's pointing things at you that he doesn't fully understand, but he is not a criminal organization, and he does not get handled the way you handle one." Kwon finally looked at her. His expression was not hostile. It was the expression of a man who respected competence and had an entirely different calculation for everything else. "This situation exists because of your marriage," he said. "If you hadn't, I know why the situation exists," she said. "That doesn't change my answer." The room held. Tae-gyeom was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read completely. Part of it was that contained thing he did when he was deciding something, but underneath it was something else, something more personal. Something that had to do with the specific situation of being in love with a woman who had just drawn a line in his office in front of his security chief and was not moving from it. "Give us a minute," he said to Kwon. Kwon left without expression. The door closed. Tae-gyeom looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. "If you're about to tell me he's right," she started. "I'm not." His voice was quiet and direct. "I'm telling you that you're right and that it doesn't make this simple." He moved to the window, stood with his back partially to her, looking at the city. "Malcolm has put himself somewhere extremely dangerous by doing what he did. Not because of the federal angle I can manage Voss. The file isn't what it needs to be for anyone to move. But because of who else pays attention when this kind of noise gets made." She felt something shift in her chest. What do you mean? He turned. There are people who have watched this city's shipping operations for a long time who are not federal investigators and are not journalists, and who do not require prosecutable evidence to make a decision. A pause. If Malcolm's name gets associated with a serious attempt to expose my operations, some of those people will assume he has more than he does and act on that assumption. She stared at him. You're saying someone else could? Yes. Not you, not Seo Kwon. Someone else entirely who Malcolm doesn't even know exists. Yes. She sat back down, not because she wanted to, because her legs made the decision independently. She pressed her hands together and looked at the middle distance and did what she always did, which was think. And what she was thinking was that Malcolm had walked into a geography he had no map for and had been leaving footprints that other people were going to follow. And he had done all of this because he was a man who could not absorb losing without converting his loss into someone else's catastrophe. Then we have to deal with him ourselves, she said, before someone else does. Tae-gyeom looked at her. Not your way, she said immediately. My way, she met his gaze. Give me a week. Zora week. I have an idea and I need a week to build it properly. She could feel the shape of it, already not complete, but present, the architecture of it available to her, in the way that strategies always became available when the necessity was clear enough. If it doesn't work in a week, we discuss other options. A long pause. You're not going to tell me what the idea is, he said. Not yet. You'll either tell me it's too dangerous, or you'll want to add people to it, and it only works the way I'm designing it. He studied her face for a long moment. She held the look because she knew what he was looking for, and she wanted him to find it. She wanted him to see that she wasn't acting from emotion, wasn't acting from the protective anger of someone who had once loved Malcolm and couldn't fully let go of that, wasn't being naive about the severity of what was in front of them. She was being precise. 1 week, he said, thank you. She left his office and went back to her desk, and for the first 20 minutes she sat there with a blank notepad in front of her and just thought. Let the shape come. Let the pieces arrange themselves in the way they always did when she gave them space instead of forcing them. Malcolm wanted leverage. He had fragments that felt like leverage, but weren't quite enough. What he actually needed, what would complete his strategy, was Zora. He needed her frightened or defecting or both. He had tried frightening her with the press, and it had produced the opposite result. He hadn't tried the defection angle yet because he hadn't had a reason to believe it was available. She was going to give him a reason. She picked up her personal cell phone, not her work line, not anything connected to Tae-gyeom's systems, and she sent Malcolm a text. 3 words. I need help. She set the phone on the desk, face down, and picked up her work and spent the next 4 hours being excellent at her job with the quiet efficiency she had maintained through every preceding crisis. And at 3:17 in the afternoon, her personal phone buzzed. Malcolm, call me. She waited 2 hours before she called. She needed the delay to be plausible. A woman reaching out in desperation would not respond instantly. She would circle it, argue with herself, pick up the phone, and put it down. She gave him the shape of that, even though he couldn't see it. When she called, he answered in 2 rings. Zora. His voice was careful. The tone of a man trying to calibrate how much hope a situation warranted. Are you all right? Not really, she said. She had thought carefully about what the next 4 sentences needed to accomplish. Not too much detail, too easily offered reads as constructed. Not too vague reads as uncertain, and uncertain people circle back instead of committing. She needed to give him something specific enough to be credible and incomplete enough to require a meeting. I've been looking at some of the things he's involved in, she said. Things I didn't know about before. I can't be part of this, Malcolm. I thought I knew what his business looked like, and I was wrong. Silence on the line. She could hear him processing it, the sound of a man deciding whether this was real or a trap, and arriving, because he wanted it to be real, at real. What did you find? He said, not on the phone. Okay, Zora. We can meet. Where are you? Somewhere public won't work. If his people see me with you, they'll... She let the sentence trail, let him build the rest of it from his own imagination, which would construct something more alarming than anything she said. There's a warehouse on the south side. It's been sitting empty for 8 months. It's in my name as part of a property holding that predates everything. Pause. Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. Come alone, Malcolm. Please. I'll be there, he said immediately. She ended the call. Then she sat at her desk for a moment with the phone in her hand and felt the weight of what she had just put into motion. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated, the awareness that she was using Malcolm's worst quality against him. His absolute conviction that she was ultimately manageable, that pressure and loneliness and fear would eventually reduce her to something he could direct. She was using that conviction as a mechanism. It felt necessary, and it felt like something she would think about later. She went to Seo Kwon's office. He was at his desk. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. I need a recording device, she said. Something small. Good quality pickup in a large space. And I need the warehouse on Halstead, prepped lights on a timer. Nothing else. No people inside. He looked at her for a long moment. No people inside, she said again. I heard you the first time. He opened a desk drawer. How small, she showed him with her fingers. He studied the gap between them and nodded once. Tomorrow night, she said. I'll have it ready. She turned to leave. Zora. She stopped. Seo Kwon's voice had shifted slightly, not warm. He didn't really do warm, but stripped of the particular professional distance he usually maintained with her. Be careful. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was looking at his desk, already opening a different drawer, already returned to the performance of his usual efficiency. I will, she said. The warehouse was cold. That was the first thing she registered when she arrived at 8:45, 40 degrees inside. If that, the kind of cold that made every surface feel provisional, the building was tolerating your presence rather than offering it. The space was enormous, roughly the size of 4 tennis courts, with a ceiling lost in shadow above the range of the work lights she'd had Seo Kwon switch on. She wore her work clothes, dark trousers, a charcoal blouse, a coat she hadn't taken off. She had not dressed the part of a woman in crisis because she needed to be credible and she couldn't perform from distress with enough consistency for 40 minutes. She would have to give him something else, clarity, controlled fear, the specific presentation of a competent woman who had seen something that changed her calculation. She knew how to do that. What she hadn't planned for was Tae-gyeom. She was standing near the center of the warehouse floor, testing the recording device's pickup range by speaking numbers quietly to herself when she heard the side door. Malcolm's footsteps were wrong. Malcolm walked heel first. She had slept beside the sound of it for 4 years. These steps were different. She turned. Tae-gyeom was standing 20 feet inside the door. Her stomach dropped 3 floors. What are you doing here? She said. Watching. He moved toward her. He was in dark clothes, not a suit, which meant he'd come here deliberately, dressed for somewhere he didn't intend to be seen. I'm not interfering, I'm watching. I told you no people. You told Seo Kwon no people inside. You didn't tell me. He stopped 10 feet from her. I'm not your employee, Zora. She stared at him, her jaw was tight. If he sees you, he won't see me. He looked at the space around them, assessed it the way he assessed every space, and moved toward the deep shadow behind a bank of shelving units along the east wall. I'll be over here. He won't know I'm present unless something requires it. Nothing will require it. Then you have nothing to worry about. She wanted to argue further, and she didn't have time to argue further, because her phone read 8:58, and Malcolm was compulsively punctual, which had once been a quality she appreciated about him. She turned back to the center of the floor. She heard Tae-gyeom settle into the shadows behind her. She couldn't see him. She reminded herself that if she couldn't see him, Malcolm couldn't either, and she breathed out, and she became the thing she needed to be for the next 40 minutes. Malcolm came through the main door at 9:02. He was wearing a coat she recognized, the gray wool one he'd bought 3 winters ago, and he looked. She thought like a man who had been running on adrenaline for 2 months and was starting to feel the bill. His face was thinner. He hadn't been sleeping well. She noted these things the way she noted everything, clinically, and filed them separately from the part of her that had once made him coffee in the mornings and known which mug was his favorite. He saw her and stopped. Then he crossed the floor toward her with an urgency that was partly relief and partly something more proprietary, the walk of a man arriving at something he believes belongs to him. Zora. He reached out like he might touch her arm. She took a step back, small, definitive. He stopped. Recalibrated. Are you okay? You sounded… I'm fine. She kept her voice controlled. Not warm. Thank you for coming, of course. What did you find? What did you see? She turned slightly, moving to buy herself a few seconds, moving the way someone moves when they're deciding how to say something. Difficult. She had the recorder active in her jacket pocket. She needed him talking. More than that, she needed him saying. The things she knew were in him, the plan, the scope of it, the deliberate construction of a false narrative he had been building for 2 months. I saw enough, she said. I've been looking at his companies. The subsidiary structures. There are things in the shipping operation that don't add up, and I think I knew that, and I talked myself out of knowing it. She turned back to face him. And then you reached Voss. Malcolm blinked. How do you know about… Because I'm not stupid, Malcolm. Because when his security team flagged that a federal investigator suddenly had new material, they looked at who the material came from. She watched his face. That was you. He straightened. Some of the relief had gone out of him, replaced by something more combative, the shift she'd seen 100 times. Malcolm moving from a position he couldn't hold to a position he'd decided to own. Someone had to do something. He's a criminal, Zora. You walked out of our marriage into an apartment owned by a man who runs. I know what he runs. Her voice was quiet and exact. And I also know that what you gave Voss was fragments. Suggestive fragments. Nothing prosecutorial. She held his gaze. You couldn't have given him anything prosecutorial because you don't have it. Which means you gave a federal investigator enough to accelerate an existing investigation without enough to actually prove anything. And you did it out of spite. Something moved across Malcolm's face. That's not. Is it not? She took a step toward him. Then tell me what it was, Malcolm. Tell me what the goal was, because from where I'm standing, it looks like a man who lost a marriage and decided the correct response was to detonate the vicinity. He took my wife. He didn't take anything. I left. Her voice didn't rise. I found your location on Christmas Eve. I left. I am a grown woman who made a decision, and you have spent 2 months trying to reframe that decision as something that happened to you. She looked at him steadily. How much did you exaggerate? When you went to Voss, how much of what you gave him was constructed? I didn't construct anything, Malcolm. A silence. Something cracked in his expression. Not collapse, Malcolm didn't collapse. He reconfigured, but a shift in the load-bearing structure of his position. He looked at her and she looked back, and the warehouse was cold and quiet around them. Some of the connections I drew were inferential, he said finally. Meaning you implied relationships that you couldn't document. Meaning I presented the pattern the way it appeared to me. And the police report, claiming I was held against my will? He had the grace to look away for a moment. I was trying to what? What were you trying to do with that specifically? His jaw set. I was trying to make him look at what he'd done. Taking another man's wife and putting her in his building like she was. He didn't put me anywhere. He offered and I accepted. She was very still now. The stillness she used in the worst negotiations, when everything needed to land, precisely. You filed a false police report. You fed exaggerated material to a federal investigator. You manufactured a press narrative designed to humiliate me using my weight and my race as the instruments of that humiliation. She let that sentence exist between them for a moment. And you did all of it because you couldn't accept that I chose to leave. Malcolm stared at her. In the eastern shadow of the warehouse, behind the shelving units, something moved almost imperceptibly. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Say it, Malcolm, she said. Her voice was barely above conversational. Tell me that's what happened. Tell me you exaggerated what you gave Voss. Tell me the police report was deliberate. Tell me the press story was something you coordinated. I'm not going to… There's no one here. She opened her hands slightly at her sides, a gesture of openness. Nothing hidden, nothing watching. It's just us. And I need to understand what I'm dealing with if I'm going to make any decisions about what comes next. He looked at her for a long moment. Malcolm Reddick had spent 15 years in rooms where the most important skill was knowing when the other person was telling the truth. He looked at his former wife standing in a cold warehouse in the dark, and he decided she was telling it. Yes, he said, I exaggerated the connections. I presented inference as documentation. And yes, the police report was I knew you weren't in danger. I knew that. I thought it would force. He stopped. Force what? Force you to reconsider, to come back. To realize that being associated with him was going to cost you more than I did. His voice had gone flat. I was trying to make you see that I was the safer choice. By manufacturing a crisis that could have destroyed his business and exposed me to federal scrutiny. By making him look like what he is. His voice hardened. He's a criminal, Zora. He smiles at charity dinners and runs clean companies on the surface. And underneath it, Malcolm. She stopped him. Look at what you just said. Look at all of it. He looked. She could see the moment it arrived. Not guilt, not quite, but recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had constructed a version of events in which he was the wronged party and is now involuntarily seeing the version from a different angle. The warehouse was very quiet. Somewhere in the building structure, metal contracted in the cold with a sound like a distant shot. Then Tae-gyeom stepped out of the shadows. Malcolm saw him and went absolutely still. He was white. Not pale white, the specific color of a man whose circulatory system has just made a decision about where the blood needs to be. His eyes went from Tae-gyeom to Zora and back, and she watched the calculation running behind his eyes. Trap, it said. Trap, 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 and she watched him arrive at the correct answer, too late. Tae-gyeom crossed the warehouse floor with the unhurried walk of a man who has already decided where the conversation ends. He stopped 5 feet from Malcolm. He said nothing. Just looked at him with the expression he saved for people who had used up every benefit of every doubt. Malcolm's voice, when it came, was thin. You were here the whole time. Yes, Tae-gyeom said. Malcolm looked at Zora. There was something in his face she hadn't seen from him before, not anger, not calculation, something more raw than either. Something that looked uncomfortably, like the understanding of how thoroughly he had lost. You set yourself up, she said quietly. I just gave you the room. Tae-gyeom moved 1 step closer to Malcolm. Malcolm held his ground physically, but his body had the tension of someone doing it by decision rather than instinct. Here's what happens now, Tae-gyeom said. His voice was completely level. The voice he used when screaming would have been less frightening. What you said in this room tonight goes to every party you've compromised. Voss, the journalist, your own attorney. The narrative you built gets corrected at the source. You can't make me. I'm not making you do anything. Tae-gyeom reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the nearest flat surface, a crate between them. That's a legal agreement. You retract. You correct. You make no further contact with federal investigators, journalists, or any party connected to my businesses or to Zora. In exchange, the recording from tonight does not become the centerpiece of harassment, extortion, obstruction, and false reporting charges. Malcolm stared at the document. Read it, Tae-gyeom said. Malcolm's jaw worked. His eyes moved to Zora. She looked back at him and she felt the complexity of it, 4 years of a shared life. The man he had been before he became this version of himself. The specific sadness of watching someone you once loved reveal that the love had always been conditional on their terms. She felt all of it, and she didn't let it move her from where she was standing. You should read it, she said. He picked it up. His hands were not steady. Tae-gyeom looked at Zora over Malcolm's bent head. His expression was something she had never seen on him before, and would spend days afterward trying to find the right word for not pride exactly, not relief, something that combined both and went beyond them into territory that didn't have a clean label. She didn't look away from it. Malcolm read the document for 4 minutes. Then he put it down on the crate and pressed both hands flat on it and stared at the surface for a moment. His breathing was audible. The warehouse was that quiet. If I sign this, he said. The recording is sealed, Tae-gyeom said. It exists as insurance. You conduct yourself according to the terms. It stays sealed permanently. And if I don't, Then you conduct yourself incorrectly, and you'll spend the next 2 years in a legal process that will be significantly more expensive than this document. Tae-gyeom's voice hadn't changed. The choice is yours, Reddick. Malcolm stood up straight. He looked at Zora, one more time, really looked. The way he hadn't looked at her in years, with something that was finally honest, even if honesty had arrived too late to mean anything useful. I'm sorry, he said. Not to Tae-gyeom, to her. She held his gaze. I know, he signed the document. He left the warehouse without looking back. The sound of the side door closing echoed in the empty space, and then there was nothing. Just the cold and the work lights, and the vast quiet of a building that had been holding a held breath and had finally let it go. Tae-gyeom stood with the signed document in his hands, and he looked at Zora across the 5 feet of warehouse floor between them. It's done, she said. For now. His voice was careful. He'll hold the terms. He's not brave enough not to. I know. He crossed the remaining distance and stood in front of her. Close. She could see the tension still in his jaw, particular tightness of a man who had spent 40 minutes in a shadow deciding against every instinct he had while watching someone he loved handle a situation he wanted to take from her, and had held himself in the shadow anyway. You were extraordinary, he said. You said that the last time. Keeps being true. She exhaled. It was a real exhale, not composed, not managed, the actual release of 2 weeks of construction and 40 minutes of execution coming down from the place she'd been holding them. Her hands were cold. Her feet were cold. The warehouse was 38 degrees, and she had been standing in it for over an hour, and she was, suddenly, very tired. Tae-gyeom put his arms around her, not dramatically, not possessively. Just she was cold and tired, and he was there, and it was the natural thing, the human thing, the thing that had nothing to do with power or strategy or the complicated architecture of what they were building together. She let herself be held for a moment. We're not done, she said into his shoulder. No, he agreed. Malcolm was the noise. The noise attracted something else. You told me that. His arms tightened slightly. Yes. She pulled back and looked at him. His face in the work lights was serious and present and close. Tell me about the something else, all of it. Not the managed version, all of it. She held his gaze. Because I can't help you navigate what I can't see. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing it, the same calculation he'd been running since the moment she walked into his world, the calculation between what he wanted to protect her from and what she was asking him to trust her with. His name is Baek Jae-sung, Tae-gyeom said finally. The name landed in the cold air of the warehouse, with a weight she didn't yet have a frame for. Tell me everything, she said. Baek Jae-sung was 71 years old, and he had survived things that should have killed him 3 times over. Tae-gyeom told her this standing in the warehouse, with the cold still in both of them, and he told it the way he told everything important, without embellishment, without the protective softening that most people apply to frightening information before they hand it to someone they care about. He told it straight because she had asked for straight, and because he had learned over the past 2 months that giving Zora anything less than the complete version was both insulting and strategically inferior. Jae-sung had built his American operation over 30 years. Not loudly, quietly, the way water builds pressure inside a structure, invisible until the moment the wall gives. He ran legitimate imports out of Los Angeles and a real estate portfolio across 4 cities and a network of subsidiary interests so cleanly documented that 3 separate federal reviews over 15 years had produced nothing actionable. Underneath that surface, careful, patient, constructed with the long view of a man who thought in decades rather than quarters, was a shipping infrastructure that moved things across the Pacific in quantities and categories that made Chicago's operations look like a neighborhood arrangement. He had wanted Tae-gyeom's port access for 6 years. Not Tae-gyeom's territory, not his client relationships or his lieutenant structure, or the specific deals he'd built with the waterfront unions over a decade of careful relationship management. Just the access. 3 specific deep-water berths and the inspection-adjacent arrangements that came with them, which were worth more than any single piece of real estate in Tae-gyeom's portfolio because they were not reproducible. Couldn't build what Tae-gyeom had built in those 3 berths from scratch. You could only acquire it. Jae-sung had made 2 previous approaches. Both times Tae-gyeom had declined, not aggressively, not in ways that created open conflict, but with the clear finality of a man who understood what he was holding and had no interest in selling it, regardless of the price. Jae-sung's had accepted the refusals. Then Malcolm Reddick's noise had reached him. He monitors disruption events, Tae-gyeom said. They were in his car now, parked outside the warehouse, the engine running for heat. Any significant turbulence in the operations of organizations. He has interest in federal attention, press coverage, internal instability. He monitors it. Uses it to identify windows. And Malcolm's noise read as a window, Zora said. Possible one. He's not certain yet. He's assessing. How do you know? Because 2 of his people came to Chicago 10 days ago. They weren't visible, but Kwon's network flagged them. He paused. And because Jae-sung sent me a message 3 days ago. She turned to look at him. A meeting request, he said. Framed as courtesy, old colleagues reconnecting. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing. Underneath it, not fear. Tae-gyeom didn't do fear in the conventional sense, but the particular alertness of a man who has identified a threat and is still calculating its full dimensions. He wants to meet next week, and you were going to tell me this when? I'm telling you now. You're telling me now, because I specifically asked you in that warehouse to tell me everything. She kept her voice level. If I hadn't asked? A pause. I was still deciding how much of this to bring to you. Tae-gyeom. I know. He looked at the windshield. I know, old habit. She turned back to the front. The street outside was empty and wet. The late February kind of wet that was cold enough to be unpleasant, without being cold enough to be clean. You're going to meet with him. Yes. And I'm coming. His jaw moved. Zor, I'm coming, she said again. Not loudly. The same tone she had used in the warehouse, the tone that wasn't asking. If this is about your port access, then it's about your shipping operation, and your shipping operation is the part of your business I know better than anyone except you. She looked at him. Put me in the room. He looked at her for a long moment. He will underestimate you, he said finally. I'm counting on it. The meeting was set for a Thursday. Jae-sung chose the venue, a private dining room in a Streeterville restaurant that communicated taste and restraint and the specific preference of men who make significant decisions in spaces where the acoustics prevent anyone at adjacent tables from hearing anything. The choice of venue was itself information. It said Jae-sung was presenting as a legitimate businessman, that he wanted the meeting to feel civilized, that he was extending the form of courtesy while the substance of what he wanted remained exactly what it had always been. Zora spent the 4 days before the meeting doing what she always did when she needed to understand something completely. She built a picture from the outside in. She pulled every public record attached to Jae-sung's American companies. Property filings, corporate registrations, insurance documentation, the annual reports his legitimate holding companies were required to file, the disclosed beneficial ownership structures that were technically accurate and architecturally misleading. She cross-referenced shipping manifests against declared cargo values and found 11 instances in the past 30 months where declared values were statistically inconsistent with the manifest quantities in ways that were individually explainable and collectively impossible. She built a map of his subsidiary network on paper, actual paper. A sound like green wood splitting, a large sheet spread across the dining table in Tae-gyeom's apartment, and she spent 2 evenings following the money flows through 4 layers of corporate structure until she found what she was looking for. It was a cluster of 3 companies in Delaware and 1 in Nevada that existed, on paper, to hold real estate. They held real estate, but their insurance relationships were with a carrier that also insured 6 of Jae-sung's shipping vessels, which was not publicly connected to any of the holding companies, and which created a financial exposure that was entirely invisible unless you were looking at all 4 layers simultaneously. If those insurance relationships became known to the carrier's regulators, if a formal inquiry were connecting the holding company network to the maritime corporations, the resulting disclosure requirements would force a restructuring of Jae-sung's American portfolio that would take years and cost him the specific advantage his current structure provided. It wasn't criminal prosecution. It wasn't enough to put anyone in a cell. But it was enough to cost him the kind of money and time and structural integrity that would make Chicago's port access look like a very poor trade for a very long headache. Put the map in a folder. She did not show it to Tae-gyeom before the meeting. He would either tell her it was too aggressive or he would want to add people to the delivery. And the delivery only worked the way she had designed it. She told herself this was strategic reasoning, and not in any part the specific satisfaction of a woman who had spent her career having her work by men who wanted to improve it before they'd fully understood it. Both things were true. She let them coexist. Thursday came cold and clear. They arrived at the restaurant separately her first, Tae-gyeom 3 minutes behind, which was deliberate staging she had proposed, and he had accepted without asking why. She wanted to be in the room and settled before Jae-sung's first impression of her was formed in the context of arriving beside Tae-gyeom. She wanted to be already present, already still, already the furniture of the room before the meeting started. Private dining room was exactly what she expected. Round table, 6 chairs, no windows. 2 of Jae-sung's people were already stationed near the wall. She clocked them without looking directly. Peripheral registration. She had learned this from watching Seo Kwon over 3 years. They were not armed in any way she could detect, but their posture communicated that detection wasn't really the point. Seo Kwon was behind her. She could feel him without seeing him. Jae-sung arrived at noon precisely. He was a small man. That was the first thing she had built a mental image from the file, and the image had been larger, more physically imposing. In person, he was slight, compact, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had long ago stopped needing size to communicate weight. His suit was gray and very good. His hair was white and cut close. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were the specific kind of sharp that came from 60 years of watching people carefully. He looked at Zora. Then he looked at Tae-gyeom, who had entered behind her and was now standing at the table. Then he looked back at Zora. His expression arranged itself into something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same real estate. The expression of a man who had anticipated the meeting one way and was now recalculating without letting the recalculation show. He spoke first in Korean to Tae-gyeom. Tae-gyeom answered in English. I prefer we conduct this in English. My strategist's Korean is functional, but not comfortable, and I don't want her at a disadvantage. A beat. Jae-sung's eyes moved to Zora. Something shifted in them, not visible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to read very controlled faces, but visible to her. Assessment. The rapid processing of information that arrived in the form of what she was, black, female, plus size, sitting at this table with her hands flat and her posture completely unhurried. Of course, Jae-sung said. His English was precise, lightly accented, the English of a man who had spent decades using language as a professional instrument. He sat down. His people remained standing. It's good to see you, Tae-gyeom. You look well. Thank you. This is Zora Bellamy. Jae-sung looked at her with the polite attention of a man who has decided something is decorative. Ms. Bellamy. Mr. Bake, she said. Food was brought. Tae-gyeom and Jae-sung conducted 20 minutes of the particular variety of conversation that functions as assessment business climate, regulatory trends, a sound like green wood splitting, the specific coded language of men who have known each other across a long and complicated professional relationship and are taking each other's temperature before anyone says anything with real content. Zora ate and listened and said nothing. She had a role in this room, and the first part of it was negative space. Jae-sung's eyes moved to her occasionally. Each time they arrived with a slightly different quality the first time, dismissal. The second, mild curiosity. The third, the recalibration of a man who has expected someone to speak and is now noticing, with the first hint of actual attention, that the silence is chosen rather than vacant. After 20 minutes, Jae-sung set down his fork. I'll be direct, he said to Tae-gyeom. The disruption of the past several months, the federal attention, the press coverage, I'm sure it's been managed. But these things leave residue, regulatory residue, relationship residue. He held Tae-gyeom's gaze. I'm in a position to offer you something that simplifies your situation considerably. consolidation of interests that would bring your port operations under a larger umbrella, one with sufficient political relationships to make current scrutiny irrelevant. In exchange for, Tae-gyeom said, a partnership, majority operational control transferring to my organization. You retain equity, meaningful equity, and the day-to-day management of your legitimate portfolio. Jae-sung's voice was smooth and entirely serious. You lose nothing of real value, Tae-gyeom. What you lose is exposure. The room was quiet for a moment. Tae-gyeom said nothing. Jae-sung continued. The disruption that drew my attention, I understand its source. Personal matter. These things happen. The problem is that personal matters leave traces, and traces accumulate, and at some point, the legitimate operation becomes inseparable from the accumulated trace in the eyes of people whose was matter. A pause. My offer protects you from that. Your offer gives you the port access you've wanted for 6 years, Tae-gyeom said. His voice was level. Jae-sung spread his hands slightly. There's no version of this where I pretend otherwise. We've known each other too long. He almost smiled. But a deal where both parties get what they want is still a deal. Tae-gyeom looked at him. Jae-sung looked back. The two of Jae-sung's people near the wall were completely still. Kwon, behind Zora, was completely still. Then Zora reached into the bag on the chair beside her and placed a manila folder on the table. Everyone in the room looked at it. Jae-sung looked at it. Then at her. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had shifted, the very first indication of actual attention. Real attention, the kind he'd been withholding since she walked in. Mr. Beck, she said. Her voice was conversational. Not aggressive, not deferential. The voice she used in rooms where she had already decided the outcome and was now executing toward it. Before we discuss the terms of any partnership, I'd like to share some research I've been doing. Jae-sung looked at Tae-gyeom. Tae-gyeom looked at the folder. His expression, she noted, without looking directly at him, had the specific quality of a man who has just realized something is happening that he didn't architect and who is deciding, in real time, whether to intervene. He didn't intervene. Jae-sung looked back at Zora. His chin lifted slightly, please. She opened the folder. She turned it to face him across the table, and she laid out what she had found, not quickly, not with the performance of someone proving something, but with the measured precision of a professional presenting a completed analysis. She walked him through the Delaware holding companies, the Nevada entity, the insurance carrier, and the 6 vessels. The disclosure exposure. She laid it out like a map. Jae-sung's face remained composed. She watched it remain composed, the way a lake surface remains composed when something large moves beneath it still on top, everything happening underneath. He looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. This is interesting research. I thought so. You're suggesting that if this information were presented to the carrier's regulatory body. I'm not suggesting anything, she said. I'm showing you what I found. What's done with it is entirely a separate conversation. A silence. Jae-sung's eyes moved to Tae-gyeom again. Your strategist is thorough. Yes, Tae-gyeom said. Where did you find her? She found me. Jae-sung looked back at Zora. The polite epistle quality was entirely gone now. What replaced it was something more complicated. Not respect exactly, not yet, but the full engagement of a man who has encountered an unexpected variable and is now genuinely processing it. This doesn't change my offer's fundamental structure, Jae-sung said. His voice had shifted slightly, still smooth, still professional, but with an edge now that hadn't been present. Changes the conversation around it. It changes whether the conversation is necessary at all, Zora said. He looked at her. She held the look. She was aware of the 2 men near the wall. She was aware of Kwon's breathing behind her. She was aware of Tae-gyeom to her right, perfectly still, watching. She was aware of her own pulse, which was elevated, and which she was managing the way she managed everything, by acknowledging it and setting it aside. You're telling me, Jae-sung said, slowly, that you will use this if I don't withdraw. I'm telling you that this information exists and that I'm aware of it. She kept her voice even. I'm also telling you that what I've shown you is the piece I'm willing to show you at this table. The documentation I've prepared is comprehensive. Multiple parties. Simultaneous delivery, she paused. If you proceed against Tae-gyeom's operation in any form, through any channel, directly or adjacently copies reach the insurance carrier's regulatory contact, the 3 banking relationships I've identified. Your Los Angeles portfolio's primary business partners, and 2 federal offices that have existing file interests in maritime operations on the West Coast. Another pause, shorter. Before morning, the room was very, very quiet. One of Jae-sung's men shifted his weight near the wall. Jae-sung raised one hand slightly, barely a movement, 2 fingers lifting, and the man went still. Then Jae-sung did something she hadn't anticipated. He laughed, not mockingly, not with menace. A genuine laugh, short, contained, the laugh of a man who has been surprised by something he finds legitimately interesting. He looked at Tae-gyeom. You brought her here to threaten me. I brought her here because she's the best strategic mind I work with, Tae-gyeom said. What she does with that is her own business. Jae-sung looked back at Zora. He picked up his water glass and drank from it slowly and set it down, and she watched him do it, and she didn't move, didn't shift, didn't give him anything to read in her posture that he hadn't already found. You're a plus-size black woman sitting across from me in a room full of men who would not typically extend you professional courtesy, Jae-sung said. He said it without heat, as simple observation. And you're not uncomfortable. No, she said. Why not? Because being uncomfortable would waste the resource. She held his gaze. I need all of my attention for the negotiation. Something shifted in Jae-sung's face. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one. Then he said, what if I told you the regulatory exposure you've identified is manageable? That my legal team has already examined similar scenarios and has response structures in place. I'd say that response structures take time, and during that time your primary banking relationships become cautious, and cautious banks make conservative decisions about which accounts they maintain, and conservative decisions about accounts have a tendency to cascade through portfolio structures that depend on a particular relationship with certain financial institutions. She paused. Managed or not, the noise costs you more than Chicago's port access is worth. Jae-sung looked at her for a long moment. Then he put both hands flat on the table. She recognized the gesture. She had made it herself in other rooms when she was done calculating and had arrived at a position. You've thought about this more carefully than most people I negotiate with, he said. Yes. How long did it take you to build this? 4 days. He was quiet for a moment. 4 days. He looked at Tae-gyeom. Kwon, you understand what you have here. I do, Tae-gyeom said. Jae-sung nodded slowly. He closed the folder in front of him. He did it without hurry, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who is closing something because he has chosen to close it and not because he has been forced. The distinction mattered to him, and she understood that and let him have it. I'll withdraw the approach, he said. The current approach. She heard the qualifier, Mr. Bake. He looked at her. The current approach, she said. I heard that. Something moved across his face. This time it was closer to a full smile, sharp, edged, genuinely appreciative. The expression of a man who has decided an opponent is worth his complete attention. You're very precise, Ms. Bellamy. I need to be, she said. I'm in a room full of men who weren't expecting me to be relevant. Beat. All approaches, he said. Current and future. Chicago was off the table. He held her gaze. You have my word. She looked at him steadily. She had no way to guarantee his word. She had the documentation and the distribution plan and the exposure she'd mapped, and those things were real. And they were sufficient pressure. And Baek Jae-sung was a man who thought in decades, which meant he was a man who understood that burning a city for one port deal was poor long-term mathematics. Thank you, she said. He stood. His people moved from the wall. He buttoned his jacket with the practiced motion of a man who had been doing it for 50 years and spoke briefly to Tae-gyeom. In Korean 2 sentences, she caught the structure but not the full content, and then he looked at Zora one more time. If you ever find yourself looking for different opportunities, he said. I'm not, she said. He nodded once. Something in it that was more acknowledgement than disappointment. He left the room with his people behind him, and the door closed, and the room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet after the compressed air of a high-stakes encounter has decompressed all at once. Tae-gyeom turned to look at her. She looked back. Kwon exhaled behind her one audible breath, the only indication she had ever seen from him of anything resembling relief. The folder, Tae-gyeom said. Yes. You didn't tell me what was in it. No. A pause. You were going to regardless of what I said. Yes. She met his gaze steadily. Are you angry? He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was processing something complex, not running from it, not managing the surface of it, actually going into it and examining it. She let him do that. She didn't fill the silence. No, he said finally. You hesitated. Because I'm thinking. He moved to the table and placed both hands on it, looking at the folder she'd left open. The documents inside. The map of Jae-sung's structure that she had built in 4 days on paper at his dining room table. He stood there looking at it for a moment. How long have you been capable of this? She frowned slightly. Of what this? He gestured at the folder. This level. This you didn't just find a pressure point. You built an architecture. You anticipated his counter moves before he made them, and you had responses already in position. He looked up at her. How long? She thought about it honestly. I don't know. The work I do for you has always required it. I've been building this way for years. I just pause. I've been applying it to your legitimate operations. This is the first time I applied it to the other side. The room was quiet. Kwon had moved to stand near the door with the patience of a man giving a conversation space it needed. Tae-gyeom straightened up. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to think of as the real one, not the public face, not the controlled professional register, the one underneath those that he showed approximately no one and had been showing her with increasing frequency over the past 2 months. I've been doing something wrong, he said. She waited. I've been treating my 2 worlds like separate things, keeping you in one and keeping the other one away from you. He picked up the folder and closed it carefully. But you just demonstrated that the wall between them it's a construct. The skills that make you invaluable on one side are the same skills that just handled Jae-sung better than I would have. He set the folder down. I've been protecting a separation that doesn't actually exist. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means, he stopped, looked at the closed folder. It means I need to think about what I'm building and whether what I've been building is what I want to leave standing. She understood what he meant, not the specific decision that would take time, and she knew it would take time, and she wasn't going to push it. But direction of it. The fact that he was standing in this room in the aftermath of a confrontation she had handled, looking at his own structure and finding something in it he wanted to revise. She picked up her bag. She picked up the folder. She was almost to the door when his voice came. Zora, she turned. He was still at the table. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for one moment, like the actual man, not the boss, not the mafia operator, not the controlled and intimidating presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, just the man, in a private dining room in Streeterville, who had just watched the woman he loved walk into a room and do something he hadn't been able to do in 6 years. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze. We're not done yet. No, he said. But we're close. She pushed the door open and walked out into the restaurant and threw it to the street, and outside the air was cold and sharp, and Chicago moved around her in its indifferent Thursday afternoon way. And she stood on the sidewalk for just a moment with her eyes closed and her face tipped up, and she breathed. The thing about defeating someone like Jae-sung, she knew, was that the defeat was conditional. His word was worth something because it cost him something, and because the alternative was worse. But a man who had spent 30 years building a continental operation did not retire a motivation because of one negotiation. He would watch. He would wait. He would recalibrate. Kwon came through the door behind her. She turned. His face was doing the thing it very rarely did, which was showing something unguarded. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been running a specific calculation for 2 months and has just received a final piece of data that resolves the equation in an unexpected direction. The insurance structure, he said. How did you find the carrier connection? It took a while, she said. The vessel registrations are public, but the policy relationships are disclosed in a subsidiary filing that she stopped. Looked at him. Does it matter? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I just wanted to know how you think. She studied his face. In 3 years of working alongside Seo Kwon, she had learned to read the small indicators of his actual state beneath the professional surface. Right now, underneath the professional surface, he looked like a man who had been protecting something for a long time and had just arrived at the conclusion that it didn't need protecting from her. Seo Kwon, she said. Yes, are we going to be all right? He looked at her. The question was not about Jasung, and they both knew it. It was about the three of them, her, and Tae-gyeom, and the man who had stood beside Tae-gyeom through everything, and had been watching her arrive into that space, with the wariness of someone who had already seen people try to occupy it and fail. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then ask me again in 6 months. She looked at him. That's not no, he said. She turned back to the street. Tae-gyeom came through the door behind them. He stood between her and Seo Kwon on the Chicago sidewalk in the Thursday cold, and he looked at the city with the expression of a man who has been carrying something a long way and is now examining whether he needs to carry it the same way for the rest of the distance. There's something I need to do, he said. Neither of them asked what. They already knew the shape of it, the slow, careful, irreversible work of a man beginning to dismantle the infrastructure of violence around the legitimate businesses he had always been more proud of than he had ever admitted. Not because Zora had asked him to, not because Jae-sung had forced him to, but because standing in a warehouse and then a restaurant and watching the woman he had chosen handle 2 consecutive crises with nothing but her mind and her nerve had shown him, in a way that nothing else had managed. What strength actually looked like when it didn't require anyone to be afraid of it. He couldn't undo his past. He wasn't trying to. But the future, the specific shape of what he built next and who he was inside it, that was still in motion. That was still his to decide. He reached for Zora's hand without looking at her. She took it without looking at him. And on a Thursday afternoon in late February, on a sidewalk in Streeterville, with Seo Kwon 3 feet to their left and Chicago in every direction, Kwon Tae-gyeom held Zora Bellamy's hand and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the most dangerous thing in his life was not the enemies outside it. It was the possibility of becoming someone worthy of what was standing right beside him. The dismantling took 6 months, not a single dramatic decision. Not one meeting where Tae-gyeom stood up and announced a transformation. It happened the way most real changes happen, incrementally, quietly, in the specific language of financial restructuring and contract termination and relationship redefinition that looks, from the outside, a sound like green wood splitting, like routine corporate housekeeping, and looks from the inside like a man carefully removing the load-bearing walls of a structure he built over 20 years and hoping the ceiling holds while he puts something different underneath it. Zora watched it happen, from close enough to see the cost of it. She had her own office now. The formal title change had come in March: Chief Strategy Officer, equity stake. Her name in the corporate documentation in the way that meant something legally and not just as a courtesy. Tae-gyeom had announced it in a company meeting with the same brisk efficiency he brought to all significant decisions, as if it had already been true for some time and the paperwork was simply catching up. Several of his directors had looked at each other, in ways she noticed and catalogued, and decided not to make a point of addressing because the battles worth fighting were the ones that required winning, and the quiet skepticism of men who would eventually be required to work with her was not that battle. She fought the battles that were that battle. In April, during a logistics renegotiation with a shipping consortium whose lead representative had spent the first 40 minutes of a meeting addressing every substantive question to Tae-gyeom rather than to her, despite the fact that she was the one who had read all 400 pages of the contract and found the indemnification clause that was about to cost them $2 million, she had put her pen down on the table and said quietly, "I'm the one you're negotiating with today." The representative had looked at her. She had looked back. The meeting had continued with the appropriate allocation of eye contact. Tae-gyeom had said nothing during any of this. After, in the elevator, he had said, You waited a long time before you said that. I was letting him demonstrate the problem completely before I corrected it, she said. Partial demonstrations are easier to argue around. He had looked at her with that window-open expression. Remind me never to be on the wrong side of your patience. You have been, she said several times. I know. He paused. I'm still here. She had let that land without responding to it, which was its own kind of response, and they had gone back to the 14th floor and their respective offices and the ordinary working machinery of a day. That was them, mostly in those 6 months. The romance was real and present, and it was also woven into the fabric of the work in a way that made separating the two feel both impossible and unnecessary. They disagreed regularly. About the pace of the restructuring, she thought he was moving too slowly on 2 of the subsidiary relationships. He thought she was underestimating the complexity of unwinding operations that had 20 years of institutional memory embedded in them. About risk thresholds, about which relationships were worth preserving and which ones needed clean breaks regardless of the history involved. The disagreements were never resolved by one of them simply yielding. They were resolved by actual argument. The kind where both people say things that are half right and have to sit with the uncomfortable geometry of the other person's half until the complete picture was visible. It was exhausting and occasionally infuriating, and it produced better outcomes than anything Zora had ever been part of professionally. She thought about that sometimes. About the fact that the most functional working partnership she had ever had was with a Korean-American ex-crime boss who was in the process of rearranging his empire because a woman he loved had shown him a sound like Greenwood through the specific medium of defeating his enemies more efficiently than he could, that there was a better way to build something that lasted. She thought about it, and she didn't know whether to find it funny or moving or simply true. Usually she decided it was all three. The divorce finalized in May. It arrived as a document, which was how most significant endings arrived, not with the weight you expected, but with the specific administrative flatness of paperwork that had been processed and stamped and returned with a filing date. Zora's attorney delivered it on a Tuesday afternoon, and Zora sat with it at her desk after everyone had gone for the day, and she read through it once. 4 years of a marriage in 37 pages of legal language. Malcolm had not contested the final terms. A sound like settlement wood splitting. He had signed the settlement agreement in April with the quietness of a man who had used up everything he had and was running on the specific exhaustion that follows the realization that the fight was never winnable. The extortion and false reporting charges had moved through the legal process with the methodical face of things that were well documented and unambiguous. His attorney had negotiated them down to a plea agreement, 1 count, probation, conditions, and Malcolm had accepted it with the posture of someone absorbing an impact they'd been building toward for months. Bryn Carraway had left the company where they both worked in February. Zora knew this from Renata, who knew it from someone, and filed it in the category of information she had sought and did not particularly need. She held the divorce document for a moment. She thought about the woman who had stood beside a Christmas tree in a hotel ballroom, holding sparkling water she hadn't touched, checking a location app with the specific dread of someone confirming something they already know. She thought about that woman with something that wasn't quite compassion and wasn't quite distance, something in between. The feeling you have about a version of yourself that you have moved far enough from to see clearly. That woman hadn't been broken. She had been compressed 4 years of quietly absorbing the weight of a marriage that asked her to be smaller in unmeasurable ways, to schedule her ambition around someone else's comfort, to call it love when it was actually management. She had not been broken by any of it. She had been, in ways she couldn't have articulated on Christmas Eve, ready. She put the document in her bag, and she went home. Tae-gyeom was there. He had a key, and she had a key, and the division between his apartment and hers had become somewhat theoretical over the course of 5 months. In the way of 2 people who have stopped performing the careful logistics of keeping 2 separate lives and have simply, without announcement, begun living one, shared one. He looked at her face when she walked in. Today, he said. Today, she confirmed. He didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't want "I'm sorry the marriage had been over since December, and its legal resolution was not a loss, but a closing, the administrative seal on something that had already stopped being real." He knew this because he paid attention to her. He poured her a drink instead, sat down across from her, let the evening exist around them without trying to fill it with the right words. Later she said, "I want to ask you something." "Yes." "The restructuring. How much of it, how much of what you're doing now, the unwinding, the clean build, how much of it would you have done without me?" He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet, not the deflecting kind. "I don't know," he said. "Best guess. I'd been thinking about pieces of it for a long time. Before you. The legitimate businesses were always the part I cared about. Most the shipping operations, the real estate portfolio, those were always the things I was actually building." He looked at his glass. A sound like changing something, but thinking about changing and dismantling the architecture that protects it are different operations. The second one requires deciding that the risk of the transition is worth the destination. A pause. "I don't think I'd decided that on my own." "What changed?" He looked up. "Watching you handle Jae-sung. Watching you build the case against Malcolm. Watching you sit in a negotiation room and redirect it with a folder and a precise sentence and no threat of violence at all." He held her gaze. "You kept winning. Against people I would have handled differently. And you won without the thing I always assumed was the only reliable instrument, a beat. That was new information." She looked at him. "You're saying I showed you a better weapon." "I'm saying you showed me that what I'd been calling strength was partly fear. Mine." His voice was even. "I was afraid that without the threat underneath everything, nothing would hold. That people would stop respecting the agreements and stop maintaining the relationships, and the whole thing would decompress." He set his glass down. "But that's not how your mind works. You build structures that hold, because they're actually beneficial to every party. You make people want to stay in the agreement." A pause. "That's not a weapon. That's architecture." She sat with that. "I'm not done," he said. "The transition. It's going to take longer than I originally thought, and there are relationships I can't cleanly exit without consequences I'm still managing." His voice was careful and honest. "I'm not going to tell you I'm walking away from everything cleanly. That's not true, and I don't say things to you that aren't true. I know that. What I can tell you is that I know where I'm going, and that I'm going there." He looked at her. "That's the most honest version of this I have." She nodded slowly. It was enough. It was actually more than enough. It was the specific kind of honesty that was rare in anyone, and almost unheard of in men who had built empires on controlled information, and she recognized it as the thing she had been watching develop in him across these months. This capacity to tell her the true version, even when the true version was incomplete. "Okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Okay. Don't make it a bigger moment than it is," she said. "I'm not absolving you of anything. I'm just saying I believe you." Something moved across his face that she had no word for. "That's the same thing," he said quietly. "From you." She picked her glass back up. Outside May had settled over Chicago in that brief period where the city remembered it was capable of beauty warm without being hot, light still in the sky at 8 in the evening, the specific relief of a Midwest spring that had been earned through months of cold. They sat together in the quiet of the apartment, and neither of them needed to make it into something more than it was. June brought the Yoon brothers. She had heard the name in fragments across 4 months of meetings, references to a territorial negotiation that had been tabled repeatedly, conflict over waterfront access that had been simmering since before she had officially been brought into the full scope of Tae-gyeom's operations. The Yoon organization ran 3 docking facilities on the south side and had been pushing, with increasing insistence, for expanded access to the deep-water berths that Tae-gyeom's operation controlled. Tae-gyeom had been managing the conflict the way he managed things. He hadn't yet found the right solution for keeping it at bay, maintaining the temperature, buying time. The problem was that buying time in territorial negotiations meant the other party's frustration accumulated interest, and by June the Yoon brothers had stopped accepting delay as an answer. They requested a formal sit-down. Tae-gyeom took it. The meeting was in a conference room at one of his legitimate properties' neutral territories, in the sense that it was his building. But the Yoon brothers had agreed to it. A sound like green wood, which meant they were coming in good faith, or they were coming to demonstrate that good faith wasn't the frame they intended to operate in. Both were possible. Both were worth preparing for. There were 4 of them. The older brother, Yoon Dae-jung, was 53, broad across the shoulders, the physical type that telegraphed power before he opened his mouth, and then turned out to be more precise in conversation than his presentation suggested. The younger, Yoon Dae-ho, was 47, thinner, faster in his speech, the one whose eyes moved through a room the way Tae-gyeom's did, cataloging, assessing, never quite landing on one thing long enough to suggest he'd found anything definitively. They brought 2 people each. Seok-hwan was on Tae-gyeom's side. Zora was on Tae-gyeom's side. Dae-ung's eyes moved to her when they sat down and stayed there for a moment with the specific quality of a man trying to categorize something that doesn't fit the expected inventory. She let him look. She had stopped performing discomfort about being looked at by men who were deciding what she was. They opened with the territorial demand. Dae-jung laid it out directly: 3 of Tae-gyeom's deep-water berths, transfer of operational control, ongoing revenue sharing. The language was formal, but the structure underneath it was simple. Give us what we want, or the alternative conversation begins. Tae-gyeom listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Zora. She had been watching the Yoon brothers during Dae-jung's presentation the way she watched everyone during negotiations, not their words, but the structure around the words, the thing the demand was actually pointing at. She had been doing this for 4 months across a dozen of Tae-gyeom's operational relationships, and she had developed a specific fluency for it. The difference between what a party asked for and what they actually required to feel that their position was secure. The Yoon brothers did not need the berths. She had understood this within 6 minutes of their opening. Their 3 Southside facilities had a capacity problem, not a territorial problem. They were moving more volume than their current access points could handle, which meant delays, which meant cost overruns, which meant unhappy clients at the end of a supply chain that had no patience for delays. They were asking for the berths because berths were the solution they could see. But berths weren't the only solution. She opened the folder she had brought, thinner than the one she'd placed in front of Jae-sung, more specific, and she spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I want to suggest something," she said. Both Yoon brothers looked at her. Dae-ho's expression shifted in real-time surprise, recalibration. The rapid adjustment of a man who had assumed the woman at the table was there for reasons other than the negotiation. She had prepared for this exact adjustment. She didn't wait for it to complete. "Your capacity problem at the Southside facilities is a scheduling problem," she said. Turn the folder to face them. "Your peak volume windows conflict with 3 other organizations using adjacent infrastructure, which creates a compounding delay that eats into your margin on every 3rd shipment." She laid a single page on the table, a scheduling analysis she had built from public manifest data, and a few assumptions she had stress-tested until she was confident in them. If we restructure the usage calendar for the relevant berths, not transfer ownership, not change the territorial arrangement, but coordinate the scheduling windows so your volume moves in the gaps rather than in competition, your capacity problem resolves without either party giving up operational control. Silence. Dae-jung was looking at the page. His eyes were moving through it with the careful attention of a man who reads numbers for a living. Dae-ho was looking at Zora. "You built this in advance." "Yes." "How did you know our capacity problem was the actual issue?" "Because you don't need our berths to expand your territory. You need them to solve a throughput problem." She held his gaze. "If it were territorial, you would have come to this meeting differently." Dae-ho sat back. Dae-jung was still reading the page. Turned it over, found the second side, kept reading. The room was very quiet. Tae-gyeom was to her right, and she could feel him being completely still. He was still when something was going the way he had decided to let it go. After 4 minutes, Dae-jung looked up. He looked at his brother. Something passed between them in a glance. A full conversation compressed into 3 seconds, the specific fluency of brothers who had worked alongside each other for 25 years. Then Tae-gyeom looked at Zora. "This resolves the capacity issue," he said. "Based on my numbers, yes. I want your operations team to verify my assumptions on your peak windows could be off by a factor I don't have visibility into." "They're not far off," Tae-gyeom said. He said it with the particular directness of a man offering a compliment who doesn't have a lot of practice offering them. "Then we need a scheduling agreement, not a territorial one," she said, "which is considerably simpler to construct and doesn't require either party to give up anything they're actually using." Another look between the brothers. Then Daeho said to Tae-gyeom, "Is she always like this?" Tae-gyeom said yes. Daeho looked at Zora. His expression had completed its adjustment, no longer the man who had walked in and dismissed her categorically, now the man who was looking at a variable he intended to account for in future. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about the scheduling agreement." The meeting ran another 90 minutes. When the Yoon brothers left, they left with a preliminary agreement and without the thing they had come to take. And the difference between those two outcomes was approximately 4 pages of scheduling analysis that had taken Zora 3 evenings to build. Seok Kwon waited until the elevator closed on the Yoon brothers. Then he looked at Zora and he said, with the cadence of a man stating a fact rather than making a proclamation, "No one is going to underestimate you twice." She looked at him. Was that a compliment? It was an observation. "From you," she said. "That's a compliment." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to one she had ever seen from him. He walked back down the hall. Tae-gyeom was beside her. He waited until Seok Kwon was out of earshot, and then he said quietly, "In 6 years of dealing with the Yoon brothers, no one has ever found a solution that let both parties leave with everything they came in holding." "They came in holding the wrong thing," she said. "They needed the solution more than they needed the win." He looked at her for a long moment. "You should be running a country." "I have enough to do," she said, and went back to her office. Summer moved through Chicago the way it always did, loudly, briefly, with the specific urgency of a city that knew it had 3 months before the cold returned and was going to extract maximum use from every one of them. By August, the most significant of Tae-gyeom's operational restructuring was complete. Not all of it. He had been honest about that some relationships unwound slowly, because unwinding them quickly would have created the kind of instability that attracted exactly the kind of attention he was trying to reduce. 2 subsidiary arrangements were still in transition. One long-standing operational relationship was in the process of being formally concluded in a way that all parties could live with. But the worst of it, the infrastructure he had built in his 30s, when fear was his instrument and the threat underneath everything, was the thing he had trusted most that was gone. Or going. Far enough gone that it was no longer the foundation. What was left was the legitimate empire, the shipping, the real estate, the logistics companies that had always been the thing he was actually most proud of, and had for 20 years surrounded, with a protective layer of violence that had eventually become load-bearing in ways he hadn't intended. Removing the load-bearing violence turned out to require, as Zora had predicted, and Tae-gyeom had suspected, replacing it with something else. What they had replaced it with was a combination of things: strategic relationships built on mutual benefit rather than mutual threat, financial structures whose stability derived from actual performance rather than intimidation, and the slow accumulation of a reputation for a different kind of reliability than the one his name had previously carried. It was less dramatic than he had built. It was also considerably more solid. She told him this in August, sitting across from him in the office that had once been hers as executive secretary, and was now hers as chief strategy officer. Same room, different geometry. The specific alteration of a space by the changed position of the person occupying it. "The Daesung relationship closed clean," she said. "This morning." His attorney confirmed, and the Nevada subsidiary filed the dissolution paperwork last week. It'll process by the end of the month. She made a note, looked up. "How do you feel?" He looked at her across the desk. He was in his jacket. He always wore the jacket. She had come to understand it was less affectation than armor. The specific protective coloration of a man who had spent 20 years using the uniform of legitimacy as cover and had eventually become, genuinely, the thing the uniform advertised. Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and I just put it down, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I said something like that about my marriage. In December, I know. A pause, I remembered it. She nodded, let it sit, went back to her notes. The quarterly review is next week. I want to restructure the way we present the logistics division. The current format buries the actual margins story, and I think the board is making decisions based on incomplete visibility. Show me the revised format. She slid a document across the desk. He picked it up and read it the way he read everything she gave him completely, without skimming, with the assumption that if she had put it in front of him, it contained something worth full attention. She had always appreciated this about him. It was rarer than it should have been. They worked for 2 hours. It was ordinary, the ordinary of two people who were good at the same things and better together than separately. A sound like green wood splitting, moving through the material with the shared shorthand of a working relationship that had been built over 3 years and refined by everything that had happened in the 9 months since December. At the end of the 2 hours, she looked up and he was watching her. What, she said. Nothing. He looked down at the document. You have something in your hair. She reached up, found a pen she had apparently put there at some point and forgotten. She removed it. He went back to the document. She looked at him for a moment, really looked. The way you sometimes look at something when you suddenly register it, after it has become so familiar that registration requires a specific, deliberate act. He was 43 now. There were places at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there when she first walked into his office. His hair was the same, his posture the same, that essential quality of controlled assessment, unchanged. But she knew now what lived underneath the control. She knew the version that appeared at 2 a.m. when something he couldn't fully manage reached the surface. She knew the version that argued with her in the kitchen over strategic timelines, with a passion that was mostly about the strategy and occasionally about the fact that he had spent 20 years making decisions without someone who would argue back. And the novelty of it still surprised him sometimes. She knew the version that sat on the other side of a desk and pretended he wasn't watching her while she worked. She knew him. The complexity of that, after 34 years of looking for someone worth knowing, was not something she had words for. She had decided not to need words for it. September brought a legal summons that belonged to the past. A federal civil case, not criminal, civil connected to a subsidiary company that had been dissolved in the restructuring, but which had outstanding contractual disputes from a period 3 years prior. Tae-gyeom's attorney delivered the news on a Monday. It was, the attorney said, manageable, a documentation-heavy process, potentially a financial settlement, nothing that approached criminal exposure. Manageable. Zora sat in on the attorney meeting. She asked 11 questions, 7 of which the attorney hadn't anticipated. Afterward, she spent 4 days reconstructing the relevant contract history from the documentation she had access to and found 2 provisions that significantly strengthened their position. She handed the analysis to the attorney on Thursday. He called her on Friday to say the opposing counsel's initial position had already softened. She told him she expected that and moved on to the next item on her calendar. Tae-gyeom found her at 6 o'clock that evening, still at her desk. He stood in the doorway of her office with his jacket off. He sometimes removed the jacket after 6, which she had come to understand was its own form of disclosure, and looked at her with an expression she now had a complete vocabulary for. Go home, he said. 5 minutes. You said that at 5:15. These are different 5 minutes. He crossed the office and closed her laptop. She looked up at him. He looked down at her with the patient impatience of a man who had accepted that managing her working hours was a negotiation he would never fully win, and had decided the partial victories were enough. Dinner, he said. Anywhere that requires you to stop working. She stood up, gathered her things with the slightly defeated efficiency of someone who has been outmaneuvered by a reasonable argument. You know I was almost done. You're never almost done. That's not a criticism. It's a structural feature. He held her coat. She put it on. I've been thinking about something. She turned. There's a property on the lakefront, he said. It's been in my portfolio for 4 years, and I've never done anything with it because I could never figure out what it should be. The location is extraordinary, and the building is structurally. He stopped. I want to walk it with you. She looked at him. As a business thing. As a both things. Something we figure out together. He met her gaze. I don't want to make decisions about what I'm building without you. She looked at him for a moment. The sentence was simple, and it was the most significant thing he had said to her in months, which was a particular quality of Tae-gyeom's communication. The most important things came without announcement, embedded in practical language, requiring her to register them for what they were. Okay, she said. Saturday, she agreed. They left the office together and took the elevator down and walked out into the September evening, which was the good kind of September, still warm enough to be outside in a jacket. A sound like the particular clarity of a city evening where the light was doing something interesting with the lake air. They had dinner at a restaurant that was not fancy and not trying to be, the kind of place Tae-gyeom chose when he wasn't staging anything. Splitting, where the food was straightforward and the tables were close together, and nobody looked at either of them with professional recognition. They talked about the lakefront property, about the quarterly review, about a book she had been reading and a conversation he'd had with Kwon about something Kwon refused to find funny, but was objectively funny. About nothing in particular. About everything in the way that two people talk, when conversation has stopped being a performance and become a place they actually live. She thought about Christmas Eve. About 43 minutes beside a Christmas tree holding a glass of sparkling water. She thought about how far the distance was from that woman to this evening, and she thought about whether distance was even the right concept, whether it was distance or whether it was simply depth. The difference between a version of herself she had been living on the surface of and the one she was living inside now. She had not become someone different. She had not shed the parts of herself that had occupied that marriage, or loved that man, or stood in that hotel ballroom trying to hold a smile together with willpower. Those parts were still there. They were part of the architecture. She had just stopped apologizing for taking up space. Christmas Eve came back around. It arrived on a Tuesday, which felt significant only in retrospect. The city looked the way it had looked. 12 months earlier, snow-black cars, the specific over-decorated quality of Chicago in late December, doing its best impersonation of a holiday card. Tae-gyeom came to her office at 5 o'clock. Come with me, he said. Where you'll see. She had learned, over 12 months, that when Tae-gyeom said you'll see, it meant he had constructed something that he wanted to give her without narrating it in advance, and that the construction was always worth the withholding. She went with him. The car took them to the Halcyon Grand. She looked at the building through the window as they pulled up. The entrance was exactly what it had been a year ago, the same doorman, the same string lights along the awning, the same black cars in a line that meant an event was happening somewhere inside. She got out of the car. Tae-gyeom came around and stood beside her on the sidewalk. He looked at the building. She looked at the building. Of all the places, she said. I know, you couldn't pick somewhere neutral. Could have, he said. I chose not to. She looked at him. He met her gaze with the contained directness that was fundamentally him, never quite performing a feeling, never quite hiding one, always in that precise space between where she had to look carefully to find what was actually there. They went inside. The lobby was decorated the way it had been the previous year, the same excess of garland and light that she had walked through 12 months ago in a burgundy dress, waiting for a husband who was somewhere else. She walked through it now differently, not because the decorations had changed. Because she had. They went to the ballroom. The doors were open. She walked through them and stopped. The room was empty. Not set up for an event, not with tables and centerpieces, and the machinery of a corporate Christmas dinner. Just the room, the enormous tree still in the center of it, the chandeliers lit, the floor bare, snow moving in slow diagonals beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tae-gyeom walked past her into the room and turned around. A year ago, he said. I know. She stood at the threshold, looking at the tree. Stood right there. I know where you stood, he paused. I'd been watching you stand there for 40 minutes before I went to you. She looked at him. 40 minutes. I was trying to decide whether to say anything. His voice was even. I knew about Malcolm. I'd known for 6 weeks, and every time I started to cross the room, I talked myself out of it because I told myself it wasn't my place, and you didn't want to be managed, and I was right about both of those things. A pause. But I was also running from the conversation, because once I started it, I couldn't unstart it. She walked into the room. The floor was the same floor. The tree was the same size. She stood beside it and looked at the place she had stood 12 months ago, and she could locate very precisely a sound like green wood splitting, the feeling that had lived in her chest in that spot, the compressed weight of a woman holding herself together in a public place, while something in her private life finished falling apart. It was still there, the feeling, not as pain, as information, as the kind of thing you keep so you know how far you've come. You took 40 minutes, she said, yes, and then you found me anyway. Yes. She turned and looked at him. Was standing in the center of the empty ballroom with his hands in his jacket pockets and snow falling in the windows behind him. He was looking at her with the real expression, the one she had spent a year learning to see. I have something, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He crossed the room to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her, and he held out his hand. In it was a ring. She looked then at him. It was not showy. It was precise. The kind of thing chosen by someone who had paid attention for a long time to the specific aesthetic preferences of the person they were choosing it for. She did not for a moment doubt that he had paid that attention. I'm not telling you that you belong to me, he said. His voice was quiet and exact. I'm not telling you that I'll keep you safe, or that being with me is simple, or that I've resolved every complicated thing in my life, and I'm presenting you with a clean version. He held her gaze. I'm asking if you want to build the rest of this with me. Knowing all of it, the parts that are good and the parts that are still being worked on, and the parts I haven't figured out yet. A pause. Knowing that I will argue with you when I think you're wrong, and tell you the truth when it's inconvenient, and be infuriatingly protective sometimes in ways you'll have to correct me about. The corner of his mouth moved. And knowing that every room we walk into together, I will spend the entire time aware that you're the most capable person in it. She looked at the ring. She thought about the woman on the bench by the frozen river, who had sat in the snow believing that betrayal had destroyed the possibility of something real. She thought about that woman with genuine tenderness, the specific tenderness you feel for yourself when you are far enough from a painful version of your own life to see it clearly, to understand what it cost you and also what it gave you, the specific education of having been reduced and choosing, afterward, not to remain reduced. Malcolm's betrayal hadn't destroyed the possibility of something real. It had removed the obstacle standing in front of it. She looked at Tae-gyeom, at the man who had sat beside her in the snow and said the true thing instead of the easy thing, who had learned, across 12 months, to ask instead of assume, who had dismantled slowly, honestly, imperfectly the infrastructure of control he had built around the things he cared about, because she had shown him that control and love were not the same instrument, who still drove her crazy in quarterly meetings when he second-guessed projections she had stress-tested 3 times, who made coffee in the mornings before she asked and remembered which mug was hers without being told, who had stood in the shadow of a warehouse for 40 minutes and held himself there while she handled the thing herself. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were not entirely steady, and she noticed that and did not mention it, because some things were worth keeping. Then he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held in the empty ballroom, with the snow falling beyond the windows, and she felt the full weight of what the year had been, all of it. The grief and the fury, and the strategic exhilaration, and the exhaustion, and the love that had built itself slowly from respect and proximity and the specific intimacy of 2 people who had let each other be known, and she held it all at once, without trying to separate it into better and worse. It was hers. All of it was hers. The wedding was in February on a Saturday, in a small room in a building that was not a hotel and not a church, and not anywhere that had significance to anyone outside of the 12 people present. Kwon stood beside Tae-gyeom. He wore the same expression he wore everywhere, which was controlled and vigilant, and underneath it, on this particular Saturday, Something that required you to look carefully to find a quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who had spent 20 years standing beside someone and had arrived, finally, at the moment where the someone was standing in the right place. Renata stood beside Zora. She cried during the vows, which she had predicted she would do and had prepared for, with approximately 8 tissues in her clutch purse, and the preparation proved sufficient. The vows were not long. Tae-gyeom had written his, and he delivered them the way. He delivered everything important without decoration, without performance, in the specific language of a man who had spent his life inside controlled precision and was choosing, for this particular occasion, to let it be transparent. Sprinsny. He said that he had spent most of his life building things that were designed to be defended, and that building something that was designed to be shared required a different set of tools, and that she had shown him where those tools were. Soundsru felt it. He said that he would spend the rest of his life arguing with her in conference rooms and making coffee in the mornings and telling her the inconvenient truth when she needed it, and learning continuously the difference between protecting something and trusting it. Zora did not cry during his vows. She listened with the full attention she brought to everything. And when he finished, she looked at him, and she could feel the 12 people in the room and the snow outside the windows, and the specific warmth of a small space full of people who were genuinely happy for the thing happening in. And she thought, this is what I was looking for. Not this exact room, not this exact man, not these exact circumstances. But this quality, this feeling of being known completely by someone who has chosen you with full information. Her vows were also not long. She said that she had walked into his office 3 years ago as a woman who was very good at making herself indispensable to other people's visions. A sound like green wood splitting, and that somewhere in the process of working alongside him, she had started to understand what it would look like to have a vision of her own. She said that he had never told her to be smaller, and that this was rarer than it should have been, and that she did not take it for granted. She said that she expected them to continue disagreeing in quarterly meetings, and that she intended to continue being right when they did. A small sound from the 12 people in the room. She said that she had chosen him with full knowledge of all of it, the complicated past, the imperfect present, the future they were still building, and that the choosing felt like the most accurate thing she had ever done. Afterward, standing outside in the February cold with Renata beside her, and Tae-gyeom 2 feet away talking to Kwon about something that was probably logistical, and probably couldn't wait even today, Zora looked at the street. Chicago in February was what it always was, gray, blunt, operating according to its own indifferent schedule. The same city it had been on Christmas Eve 13 months ago when she had stood at a river in the snow believing her life had been reduced to its worst moment. It hadn't been. It had been at an inflection point. The difference between a reduction and an inflection point is not visible from inside the moment. From inside the moment, they feel identical, the same loss, the same disorientation, the same sensation of a floor that has stopped being reliable. You can only tell them apart from the distance. She had the distance now. She looked at the city, and she felt the full length of the distance, not with the nostalgia of someone looking backward, but with the clarity of someone who has learned, from a specific and difficult year, that she was capable of more than she had previously been permitted to demonstrate. Not because she had become more, because she had stopped allowing herself to become less. Tae-gyeom finished the logistical conversation with Kwon and came to stand beside her. He reached for her hand without ceremony, without announcing the gesture, the way you reach for something that is simply there and simply yours, in the best sense of belonging, not owned, not managed, just present and chosen and held. She took his hand. They stood on the Chicago sidewalk in February, the city around them, loud and cold, and completely indifferent to the specific seismic fact that Zora Bellamy and Kwon Tae-gyeom had just done the most ordinary, extraordinary thing 2 people can do, which is decide that the rest of their lives will be better together than apart. The snow started again. Neither of them moved. They had nowhere to be except here, and here, for the first time in a long time, was exactly enough.